Chapter 1. The Closing of the Gate. You are standing in the inner bailey of Harwood Castle on an afternoon that has forgotten it was ever meant to be bright. The sky above the curtain wall is a uniform wash of grey wool that seems to press downward without any particular urgency, and the air has that particular dampness of late autumn when the leaves have long since fallen, but the true bite of winter has not yet arrived to freeze the mud into something solid and less troublesome. You are not here for any great purpose. There is no ceremony to attend and no command being given. You are simply here because this is where the day has placed you, and the day itself appears content to ask nothing of anyone beyond the simple act of standing still. The gate you face is the main gate, the one that opens onto the long sloping track that winds down through the outer defences toward the pastures and the village, and the distant road that eventually finds its way to towns you may have heard mentioned but cannot quite picture with any clarity. It is made of oak timbers so thick and so ancient that they have taken on a colour somewhere between wet earth and storm-ploughed, and the iron bands that hold them together are blackened with age and the slow patient rust that comes from centuries of standing in weather that is never quite dry. There are heavy iron studs driven into the wood in rows, and you notice without particularly meaning to that, someone long ago arranged them in a pattern that is almost, but not quite symmetrical, the sort of detail that only becomes visible when you have nothing else to occupy your attention. The bar that will close this gate for the foreseeable future rests nearby, a single massive beam of heartwood that has been smoothed by countless hands over countless years until it gleams faintly even in this dull light. Two men of the garrison are maneuvering it into position with the slow, deliberate movements of people who understand that hurrying with something this heavy serves no purpose at all. They do not speak to one another except for the occasional grunt that is more a release of breath than an actual word, and their boots scuff against the cobblestones in a way that echoes briefly before being swallowed by the damp air and the heavy stone walls that surround you on every side. You watch them because there is nothing else that requires watching, and because the sight of people engaged in a task that will be completed exactly once and then left undisturbed for an unknown stretch of time has its own quiet fascination. The iron brackets that will receive the bar are set into the stone on either side of the gate passage, and they are worn shiny in the spots where the wood has rubbed against them over generations of similar closings. One of the men runs his thumb along the edge of the bracket, perhaps checking for burrs or perhaps simply because the metal is cool and smooth, and there is a certain comfort in touching something that has remained unchanged for longer than any living memory can reach. You notice the way his thumb leaves a faint print on the surface that fades almost immediately as the thin film of dampness reclaims the space. And you think without any particular urgency about how many thousands of hands have touched this same spot and left prints that vanished just as quickly into the patient stone. The bar lifts, the men shift their grip, and then there is a sound that you will come to know very well in the weeks ahead, even though you will only hear it produced this single time. It is the sound of oak sliding against iron and then settling into its cradle, a deep and resonant thud that travels up through the soles of your shoes and into the bones of your ankles and shins. The sound does not echo so much as it absorbs into the walls themselves, becoming part of the fabric of the castle rather than something that bounces away and diminishes. It is a sound of finality presented without drama, a simple mechanical fact that changes everything and nothing all at once. The gate is closed, the bar is set, and the outside world that you knew this morning has become a different thing entirely, a place that exists only in memory and in the view through the narrow arrow loops that line the upper walls. After the bar settles, there is a period of quiet that seems to last longer than it actually does. The two men step back and look at their work with the expression of people who have completed a task they have done many times before and will do many times again, assuming the world continues in its ordinary fashion. One of them wipes his hands on the front of his tunic, a garment of undyed wool that has been patched at the elbow with a slightly different shade of undyed wool, and the other man simply turns and walks away toward the kitchen entrance without saying anything at all. The gate remains where it has always been, solid and dark and utterly immovable, and you remain where you have been standing, watching the place where the bar meets the iron bracket and noticing the way a single strand of cobweb has been disturbed by the motion and now hangs loose and trembling in a draught you cannot feel. The bailey around you is not large by the standards of the great keeps you have heard described in tales, but it is sufficient for its purpose, and you have never known any other space with this particular arrangement of stone and mud and thatch. To your left, the wall of the great hall rises with its one large window set high and covered not with glass, but with oiled linen that glows faintly from the fire within. To your right, the stables press against the inner curtain, and you can hear the occasional soft stamp of a hoof on packed earth, and the low rumbling breath of animals who have no understanding of gates or sieges, or the passage of time beyond the rhythm of feeding and resting. Straight ahead, the well stands with its wooden cover and its windlass and its rope that disappears into darkness, and beyond that, the entrance to the undercroft where the barrels and sacks are stored in careful rows that someone has counted and recorded on a slate that hangs from a peg beside the door. You become aware of the smell that will define the coming months, though at this moment it is still fresh enough to be noticeable rather than simply the background atmosphere of existence. It is a combination of wet wool from the cloaks and blankets that never fully dry between one wearing and the next, of grain dust that has settled into the cracks of the floorboards and the mortar between stones over years of grinding and measuring and spilling, and of the particular mustiness that belongs to old stone that has been wet for so long it no longer remembers being dry. There is also the fainter scent of wood smoke from the hearth in the great hall, and the sharper note of the rushes that cover the floors inside, which have not been changed since the last feast day, and will not be changed again until someone decides that the situation has become more pressing than the desire to conserve clean straw for the animals. You walk slowly across the bailey without any particular destination in mind, your feet finding their own path along the worn cobbles that have been smoothed by centuries of similar aimless walking. The dampness has made the stones slick in places, and you adjust your weight automatically without conscious thought, the way a body does when it has lived in a place long enough to know its surfaces intimately. You pass the well and pause to look down into the darkness without really expecting to see anything, and you hear the faint, distant sound of water dripping somewhere far below with a regularity that is almost but not quite a rhythm. The sound is so quiet that you must hold your breath to hear it, and when you do, you become aware of your own heartbeat and the slight ringing in your ears that is always present when the world becomes still enough to notice such things. The door to the undercroft stands open, and inside you can see the steward moving among the barrels with a rushlight held high and a scrap of parchment in his other hand. He's counting things, you understand, though you cannot hear the numbers he murmurs under his breath, and you have no particular desire to know them. The light from his rushlight catches the curves of the barrels and the rough surfaces of the sacks that line the walls, and it throws shadows that move slowly as he moves, elongating and contracting against the stone in a way that is almost hypnotic to observe. The smell of grain is stronger here, a dry and dusty scent that makes the back of your throat feel slightly tight. And there is also the sharper smell of the brine in which the salted fish are packed, a smell that you will come to associate with the passage of days and the gradual emptying of containers. The steward does not notice you standing in the doorway, or if he does, he gives no indication of it. He continues his slow circuit of the room, pausing now and then to lift the lid of a barrel and peer inside, then making a small mark on his parchment with a stub of charcoal wrapped in a bit of cloth. The lids are heavy, and they make a soft scraping sound when they are lifted and replaced, and the sound of his footsteps is muffled by the packed earth floor that has absorbed the moisture of centuries and now feels almost like stone itself, under a thin layer of scattered grain husks. You watch him for a while because there is comfort in observing someone engaged in a task that requires nothing of you, and because the rhythm of his movements is as steady and predictable as the dripping water in the well. After a time you turn away from the undercroft and continue your slow circuit of the bailey. The light is beginning to change now, not fading exactly because there was never enough light to properly fade, but shifting from the flat grey of afternoon to a slightly deeper grey that suggests evening is approaching without any particular hurry. The window in the great hall glows a bit brighter as someone inside adds fuel to the fire, and you can hear the low murmur of voices that carries through the walls without any distinct words, just the rise and fall of human speech that has become part of the background texture of this place, along with the wind and the dripping water and the soft sounds of animals. You find yourself near the base of the northwest tower, where a narrow stone bench has been built into the wall at some point in the past by someone who understood that people would sometimes want to sit and look at nothing in particular. The bench is cold and slightly damp when you lower yourself onto it, but your cloak provides enough of a barrier that the discomfort is only a distant awareness rather than anything that requires action. From here you can see the gate again, the dark rectangle of oak and iron that now separates the world inside from the world outside, and you notice that the single strand of cobweb has stopped trembling and now hangs motionless in the still air. The clouds above the battlements have not changed their shape or color in the time you have been sitting, and you understand without thinking about it that they will not change for many days to come. This is the season when the sky becomes a single unbroken sheet of grey that moves slowly from horizon to horizon, without ever revealing the sun or the moon or any variation that might mark the passage of one day into the next. The light will come and go in a gradual wave that peaks at a sort of pale brightness around midday, and then subsides into darkness that is barely distinguishable from the daytime grey except for the appearance of candles and rushlights in the windows. The smell of wet wool rises again as you shift on the bench, and your cloak releases the moisture it has been absorbing from the air all afternoon. You notice that your hands have become slightly cold, and you tuck them into your sleeves without urgency, feeling the rough texture of the wool lining against your skin. There is a loose thread somewhere near your left wrist, and you find it with your fingers and worry at it absently, not pulling hard enough to break it, but just tracing its path through the weave and back again. This is the sort of small occupation that fills the hours when there is nothing else to fill them, and you have become very good at finding such occupations over the years. The bailey is empty now, except for you and the quiet presence of the animals in the stables and the distant murmur from the great hall. The two men who barred the gate have disappeared into whatever corners of the castle they occupy when they are not needed, and the steward has finished his counting, or at least paused in it long enough to seek his own meal and his own place by the fire. The only movement is the slow drift of the grey clouds above, and the even slower settling of the stone walls as they adjust to the changing temperature of the evening air, a process so gradual that it produces no sound you can hear, but only a sense of immense weight and patience. You think about the gate without particularly meaning to, about the bar that now rests in its brackets, and the way the iron has accepted the wood as though it has been waiting for this moment. You think about the track outside that leads down to the village and the fields and the road, and you understand that you will not walk that track again until some condition has been met, some arrangement made between the lord of this castle and the forces that have gathered in the distance. You do not know what those forces want or what they will be offered in exchange for leaving, and you find that you do not particularly care. These are matters for other people, people whose names you know, but whose concerns have never been yours, and your own concerns have been reduced to the simple business of waiting and watching, and feeling the slow rotation of the hours. The dampness in the air has increased slightly, and you notice a faint sheen of moisture on the cobblestones that catches what little light remains and turns it into a soft gleam that is almost beautiful in its understatement. A single drop of water falls from somewhere above, perhaps from the lip of a stone gutter or the edge of a roof slate, and it lands on the stones near your feet with a sound so quiet that you feel it more than hear it. Another drop falls a moment later, and then another, and you realize that it has begun to rain in the way that it always rains here in this season, a rain that is more a presence than an event, a fine mist that settles onto everything without the energy to properly fall. You remain on the bench for a while longer, as the mist thickens into something that might be called drizzle if you were inclined to make distinctions. The dampness seeps into the wool of your cloak and the stone of the walls and the packed earth of the bailey, and it will continue to seep for hours and days and weeks until everything in the castle has absorbed as much moisture as it can hold, and the rest simply pools in the low spots and slowly evaporates or drains away through channels cut into the stone by builders who understood this climate and prepared for it. You watch the gate in the gathering darkness and listen to the soft sound of the rain on the roof of the great hall, a sound that is so constant and so gentle that it will soon become impossible to notice unless you deliberately attend to it, and you feel the weight of the closed gate settling into your awareness like the bar settling into its brackets, a fact that changes everything and nothing at all. The evening has arrived without announcement, and the world inside the walls has contracted to the small circle of warmth and light that will sustain it through the coming months. You rise from the bench eventually, because the damp has begun to make your joints ache in a way that is not yet painful, but promises to become so and you walk slowly toward the entrance of the great hall, where the firelight spills out onto the wet stones, and the smell of cooking drifts through the open door. Behind you the gate stands dark and silent and closed, and it will remain so for a long time, long enough that you will forget the sound of it opening, and will have to learn it again when the time finally comes. But that time is far away, and not worth considering on this damp autumn evening, when the only thing required of you is to find a place by the fire and let the hours pass in their own slow and patient fashion. Chapter 2. The Inventory of the Larder. You find yourself in the undercroft of Harwood Castle on a morning that is indistinguishable from the afternoon that preceded it, and the evening that will follow, the same grey light filtering through the same high narrow slits that pierce the foundation stones, the same cool dampness rising from the packed earth floor to meet the cool dampness descending from the vaulted ceiling. The steward is already present when you arrive, as he always is at this hour, standing near the centre of the room with his rushlight held aloft, and his scrap of parchment resting on an overturned barrel that serves as his desk. He does not acknowledge your presence beyond the slightest shift of his weight that might be an invitation, or might be simply the adjustment of a man whose feet have grown tired of standing on packed earth, and you take your place near the doorway where the light is dim enough to be restful but sufficient to observe the proceedings without strain. The undercroft stretches away from you into shadows that deepen gradually, rather than abruptly, the far corners lost in a darkness that seems to swallow the edges of the barrels and sacks, arranged in careful rows along the walls. The ceiling is low enough that a tall man would need to duck, though the steward is not tall and neither are you, and the stones that form the vaulting have been blackened over centuries by the smoke of rushlights and the slow respiration of the stored goods themselves. There is a smell down here that you have come to know as well as your own breath, a complex layering of grain dust and old wood, and the particular sharpness of brine that rises from the salted fish barrels and mingles with the earthier notes of root vegetables slowly decaying in their beds of sand. It is not an unpleasant smell exactly. It is simply the smell of survival, measured out in sacks and barrels and jars. The smell of a community that has withdrawn into itself and must now live on what it has gathered against the long grey months ahead. The steward clears his throat, the sound that is more texture than noise, and begins his work. His method is always the same, and you have observed it so many times that you could describe it in your sleep, which is perhaps the point of observing it now. He moves first to the row of grain sacks that line the eastern wall, their rough brown fabric bulging with the weight of oats and barley and rye that was harvested in the summer and threshed in the early autumn, and carried up the track in carts that will not move again until the world outside has resolved whatever dispute, has closed the gate. Each sack has been marked with a symbol drawn in charcoal, a simple cross or circle or line that indicates its contents to those who know the code, and the steward runs his fingers over these marks as he passes, reading them the way another man might read words in a book. The first sack he actually opens is one of oats, and you watch as he works loose the leather cord that binds its neck and folds back the coarse fabric to reveal the pale grey kernels within. The oats are dry and cool to the touch. You know this because you have touched them yourself on other mornings, and they shift against one another with a soft rustling sound that is almost musical in its gentleness. The steward plunges his hand deep into the sack and withdraws a fistful of grain, which he examines in the light of his rushlight before letting it trickle back through his fingers and into the darkness of the sack. He makes a small mark on his parchment and moves to the next sack, which also contains oats, and the process repeats with the same slow deliberation as before. You lean against the stone wall behind you, and feel the coolness of it seep through the wool of your tunic and into the muscles of your back. The wall is damp, in the way that all walls in Harwood Castle are damp, a condition so permanent and so universal that you no longer think of it as dampness, but simply as the natural state of stone. A single drop of water has formed on the ceiling directly above the grain sacks, the result of condensation from the warmer air of the undercroft meeting the colder stone of the vault, and you watch it grow larger and rounder until it finally releases and falls with a soft plink onto the packed earth near the steward's feet. He does not look up. He has heard this sound 10,000 times, and it no longer registers as anything but the background music of his daily labor. The oats give way to barley, the barley to rye, and the rye to a small collection of sacks containing dried peas that rattle against one another with a harder, sharper sound when the steward disturbs them. The peas are smaller than the grain kernels, and their colour is a sort of greyish green that reminds you of the moss that grows on the north side of the chapel wall, though you cannot say why this comparison occurs to you now. The steward counts the pea sacks twice, running his thumb over the charcoal mark on each one, as though confirming something he already knows, but feels compelled to verify again, and then he makes another notation on his parchment and moves on to the barrels. The barrels are arranged in 2 rows against the western wall, their curved sides dark with age and the slow absorption of whatever they contain. Some are tall enough to reach your waist, others are smaller and squat, and have been fitted with tight wooden lids that must be pried loose with a blade. The steward carries a small iron tool for this purpose, a flat wedge of metal with a handle wrapped in leather that has grown smooth and dark from the oils of his palm, and you watch as he works it into the seam between lid and barrel and applies a steady pressure until the seal releases with a soft sigh of air. The first barrel contains salted herring packed in layers with coarse grey salt that sparkles faintly in the rushlight, and the smell that rises from it is so sharp and so briny that you can taste it on the back of your tongue, even from across the room. The steward peers into the barrel for a long moment, his face illuminated from below by the light reflecting off the surface of the brine that has gathered in a shallow pool above the fish. He is counting, you understand, though you cannot see the fish yourself, and would not know how many should be there even if you could. The numbers are written somewhere on his parchment, in a system of marks that only he fully comprehends, and when he is satisfied that the count matches the record, he replaces the lid and taps it gently back into place with the heel of his hand. The sound is hollow and resonant, the sound of wood on wood echoing briefly in the confined space before being absorbed by the packed earth and the damp stone. There are 6 barrels of herring, or perhaps 7. You lose count because the steward's movements are so slow and so regular that your attention begins to drift toward the other details of the room. You notice the way the rushlight casts a warm orange glow on the curved surfaces of the barrels, creating highlights that shift and flow as the steward moves past them. You notice the cobwebs that have accumulated in the angles of the vaulted ceiling, grey and delicate and undisturbed, except for the occasional trembling caused by the movement of air that you cannot feel. You notice the small pile of spilled grain near the base of the eastern wall, where a sack must have torn at some point in the past, and no one has bothered to sweep up the remains because the rats and mice will find them eventually, and there is no sense in depriving the creatures of what would only go to waste otherwise. The steward has moved on to the barrels of salted pork, which are larger than the herring barrels and sealed with a layer of rendered fat that has hardened into a smooth white cap over the meat beneath. He does not open these barrels fully, only lifts one corner of the fat cap with his iron tool and peers into the darkness below, smelling rather than seeing the condition of the meat. The smell is different from the herring, richer and earthier, and with a faint sweetness that comes from the long, slow curing process that began last autumn when the pigs were slaughtered and their flesh packed away against the lean months. You have tasted this pork many times, boiled into a grey and fibrous substance that provides sustenance without pleasure, and you will taste it many times again before the gate opens and the world outside returns to its ordinary rhythms. Next come the barrels of hard cheese, round wheels wrapped in cloth that has been soaked in brine and dried to a stiff crust. The steward unwraps one wheel carefully, folding back the cloth to reveal the pale yellow surface beneath, which is mottled with veins of blue-grey mould that spread in patterns resembling the cracks in old pottery. He scrapes a small amount of the mould away with his thumbnail and examines the cheese beneath, then presses his finger into the surface to test its firmness. The cheese gives slightly, but not too much, retaining the proper texture of something that has been aged for the correct amount of time and will continue to age in the cool darkness of the undercroft until it is needed. He rewraps the wheel with the same care he used to unwrap it, and makes another mark on his parchment. The root cellar occupies a separate chamber off the main undercroft, a smaller room dug deeper into the earth where the temperature remains constant throughout the year, and the darkness is absolute unless someone brings a light. The steward ducks through the low archway, and you follow, because there is nothing else to do, and because the slow rhythm of this inventory has become a sort of meditation that you are reluctant to break. The root cellar smells of earth in its purest form, the clean mineral scent of soil that has never been disturbed by plough or spade, and underneath that the fainter sweetness of the vegetables that are slowly sleeping in their beds of sand and straw. The carrots are buried in a long wooden trough filled with dry sand, only their green tops visible above the surface, though those tops have long since withered to brown threads that crumble at a touch. The steward reaches into the sand and withdraws a single carrot, brushing away the grains to reveal the bright orange flesh beneath, which is firm and smooth and shows no sign of the shriveling that will eventually come. He returns the carrot to its sandy bed and pats the surface flat again, then moves to the turnips, which are stored in a similar fashion but in a separate trough, because they require slightly different conditions, and because someone long ago established this arrangement and no one has seen fit to change it. The cabbages hang from the ceiling beams by their roots, swaying gently in the air currents created by your presence. Their outer leaves dried to a papery brown that rustles softly when the steward brushes past them. The heads beneath the dried outer layers are still pale and dense, the leaves pressed tightly together in concentric circles that will unfold slowly in the pot when the time comes. There are fewer cabbages than there were when the gate closed, you notice without needing to count, and the space between the hanging heads has grown wider in a way that speaks to the quiet consumption of the weeks that have passed. The onions are braided into long ropes that hang from pegs driven into the wall, their papery skins the color of old parchment, and their shapes varying from perfectly round to slightly elongated in the way of things that grow in soil, rather than being made by human hands. The steward runs his palm along one of the ropes and the dry skins crackle under his touch, releasing a faint, sharp scent that makes your eyes water slightly even from a distance. He counts the ropes with his finger, touching each one in turn and murmuring the numbers under his breath. And then he makes his final notation and turns back toward the main undercroft. You return to your place near the doorway while the steward completes his circuit of the remaining stores. There are jars of honey sealed with wax and stacked in a corner where the temperature remains cool enough to prevent crystallization, their contents glowing amber when the rushlight passes near them. There are small sacks of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling alongside the cabbages, their fragrances mingling into a single complex scent that speaks of meadows and summer and a world that seems very far away from this dim room beneath the castle. There are clay pots of preserved fruit, submerged in honey or wine, or simply their own reduced juices, and the steward lifts each lid and sniffs the contents before replacing it and moving on. The light from the rushlight has begun to gutter now, the flame shrinking as the rush is consumed, and the pool of melted tallow that feeds it diminishes. The steward notices this without comment and reaches into a niche in the wall where a fresh bundle of rushes waits, their ends dipped in tallow and allowed to harden into a pale, waxy coating. He lights the new rush from the dying flame of the old one, and the light steadies and brightens, throwing fresh shadows against the walls and revealing details that had been lost in the dimness. You become aware of the passage of time not through any change in the light, which remains constant in this windowless space, but through a subtle shift in your own body, a slight stiffness in your knees and a dryness in your throat that suggests the morning has advanced into afternoon. The steward shows no sign of fatigue or hunger. He continues his slow circuit with the same measured pace he maintained when he began, and you understand that this work will occupy him for many hours yet, that the counting and recording and checking of seals and the sniffing of brine will continue until every sack and barrel and jar has been accounted for, and the parchment is filled with marks that only he can interpret. You watch him for a while longer, noting the way his shadow moves across the curved surfaces of the barrels and the rough texture of the grain sacks, noting the soft sounds of his footsteps on the packed earth, and the occasional creak of a lid being lifted or replaced. The undercroft has its own particular rhythm, a slow and steady pulse that matches the slow and steady consumption of the stores it contains, and you find yourself sinking into that rhythm until your own breathing seems to align with it, and your thoughts become as slow and as patient as the dripping of water from the ceiling vault. Eventually you will leave this place and return to the grey light of the bailey and the other slow rhythms of the castle under siege. But for now you remain in the doorway, neither fully inside nor fully outside, watching the steward count his sacks and barrels and jars, listening to the soft sounds of survival being measured out in increments of grain and brine and wax, and feeling the weight of the closed gate settling around you like the cool, damp air that fills this room and will not leave until the world outside decides to open again. Chapter 3. The cistern and the well. You discover that water has its own calendar inside the walls of Harwood Castle, a system of measurement that runs parallel to the slow turning of days and nights, but operates according to different rules entirely. The well in the inner ward is the center of this calendar, a dark mouth in the cobblestones that opens onto depths you have never seen and will never see, and the sound that rises from it is the constant background against which all other sounds must measure themselves. You have come to know this sound as intimately as your own breathing, a soft, steady dripping that never quite falls into rhythm and therefore never quite fades from awareness, the way a true rhythm eventually must. The well itself is ancient, older perhaps than the castle walls that surround it, a shaft driven down through stone and earth, and more stone until it finds the seam of water that has fed this hilltop since before anyone thought to build upon it. The opening is ringed with dressed stone, worn smooth by generations of hands and ropes, and the simple passage of bodies leaning over to peer into the darkness below. A wooden cover rests across the mouth when the well is not in use, constructed of heavy planks fitted together with iron bands and fitted with a smaller hinged door through which the bucket can be lowered without removing the entire assembly. This smaller door is open now, and you can see the rope descending into blackness, growing fainter and thinner until it disappears entirely at the point where the light from the grey sky above can no longer follow. The windlass stands beside the well on a frame of oak that has darkened to the colour of wet earth over the years of its service. The drum around which the rope winds is polished to a high gloss in the centre, where the rope makes its greatest contact, and rougher at the edges where the coils overlap less frequently. The iron crank that turns the drum is worn smooth by countless palms, and there is a particular spot near the handle where someone's thumb has created a shallow depression in the metal over decades of use. A small divot that catches the pad of your own thumb when you take your turn at the crank. You have taken your turn many times now, more times than you can count or would wish to count, and the motion has become so familiar that your body performs it without requiring any direction from your conscious mind. The rope itself is made of hemp that has been soaked in tar to preserve it against the constant dampness, and it carries the smell of that treatment even now, after what must be years of submersion and exposure. The smell is sharp and medicinal and slightly sweet all at once, and it clings to your hands after you have touched the rope and must be washed away with water that has itself come from the well, a small cycle of cleanliness that seems to serve no purpose beyond the satisfaction of completing a task. The rope is frayed in places where it has rubbed against the stone lip of the well, and someone has wrapped these spots with thin strips of leather that have been stitched tight and soaked in beeswax to hold them firm. The repairs are old and darkened with age, but they hold as they have held through thousands of descents and ascents, and you trust them in the way you trust all the old things in this castle, not because they are perfect, but because they have proven themselves adequate over time. The bucket that hangs from the rope's end is somewhere below you now, invisible in the darkness, and you know without seeing that it has reached the water because the rope has gone slack in that particular way that speaks of buoyancy rather than tension. The bucket itself is made of wooden staves bound with iron hoops, and it leaks slightly from a seam that has never quite sealed properly, despite repeated applications of pitch and the swelling that comes from constant immersion. This leaking is not a flaw, but a feature of the bucket's character, a small constant loss that must be accounted for in the rhythm of drawing and carrying and pouring, and you have learned to move with a certain briskness between the well and the kitchen door to minimize the trail of drips that marks your passage across the cobblestones. You lower your hands to the crank and begin the slow work of raising the bucket. The first few turns are easy, the weight of the rope itself providing little resistance. But as the bucket rises from the water and the full column of wet hemp begins to add its burden, the resistance increases in a gradual curve that your muscles have learned to anticipate. The crank makes a sound as it turns, a low creaking that is not quite a squeak and not quite a groan, but something between the two, a sound that speaks of wood under stress and iron bearing weight and the patient labour of centuries. This sound carries across the inner ward and mingles with the dripping from the well and the distant murmur of voices from the great hall and the even more distant sound of wind moving across the battlements high above. The bucket emerges from the darkness slowly, first as a suggestion of something pale moving in the depths, then as a distinct shape that resolves into the familiar curves of wood and iron, and finally as the bucket itself, streaming water from its leaky seam and swinging gently on the end of the rope. You guide it to the stone lip with one hand while continuing to turn the crank with the other, a coordination that would require attention if you had not performed it so many times that your body now manages it without conscious direction. The bucket settles onto the stone with a soft thud and a slosh of water against wood, and you release the crank and let the rope go slack again. The water in the bucket is clear and cold and carries a faint taste of stone when you cup your hand and bring a small amount to your lips. This taste is not unpleasant. It is simply the taste of the earth through which the water has filtered on its long, slow journey from wherever rain first fell to wherever this seam originates. And it reminds you of the smell of the undercroft and the dampness of the walls and all the other ways in which stone makes itself known in this place. You drink only a small amount because water is no longer something to be consumed freely, and the discipline of conservation has become as automatic as the turning of the crank. The cistern beneath the keep is a different matter entirely. A large chamber cut into the bedrock directly below the great hall, and access to a narrow stair that spirals downward from a door near the kitchen. This cistern collects rainwater from the roofs and channels it through a system of stone gutters and lead pipes that have been in place for so long that no one living remembers their installation. The water in the cistern is softer than the well water, lacking the mineral taste of the deep spring, and it is reserved for washing and cleaning, and the watering of the few animals that remain in the stables. You have been down to the cistern many times, more times since the gate closed than in all the months before, and you have come to know its particular atmosphere as well as you know the wells. The stair to the cistern is narrow and worn in the centre, where countless feet have descended and ascended over the years, and the walls are close enough that your shoulders brush against them if you are not careful. There are no windows here, no arrow loops or ventilation shafts, and the darkness is absolute until you bring a light of your own making. You carry a small clay lamp filled with oil that has been pressed from seeds harvested in a summer that seems impossibly distant now, and the flame throws shadows that move and shift with each step you take, creating the illusion that the walls themselves are breathing. The cistern chamber opens at the bottom of the stair, a space perhaps 20 feet across and domed with stone that has been blackened by the smoke of countless lamps and torches brought down here over the centuries. The water itself fills most of the floor, a dark surface that reflects the flame of your lamp and multiplies it into a scattered constellation of light points that shimmer and dance with the slightest movement of the air. The water is still in a way that the well water never is, protected from the wind and the disturbance of buckets and ropes, and its surface is so smooth that you can see the reflection of the vaulted ceiling above you with perfect clarity. The level of the cistern is marked on the wall near the bottom of the stair, a series of lines scratched into the stone at various heights and labelled with symbols that indicate the months and years when the water reached those points. The highest marks are near the top of the wall, recording winters when the rains were heavy and the cistern filled to overflowing, and the lowest marks are near the water's current surface, recording summers of drought when the level fell to a thin pool at the very bottom. You study these marks each time you descend, noting the relationship between the current level and the marks of previous years, calculating without numbers the rate at which the water is being consumed and the likelihood that the rains will return before the cistern empties entirely. The current level is lower than it was when the gate closed, lower than it was last week and the week before that, and you can see the line of damp stone above the water surface where the level has receded over the days of the siege. The retreat is slow enough that you cannot perceive it from one visit to the next, only by comparing the present to a memory that grows increasingly unreliable with each passing day, and so you have begun to rely on the marks on the wall and the small stone you place at the water's edge to track the changes. The stone is wet on one side and dry on the other, and when you return tomorrow or the day after, the wet portion will have shrunk by an amount so small that you will need to hold the stone close to your lamp to be certain of the difference. You lower your lamp toward the water and watch the reflection ripple, and then steady as the flame finds its equilibrium. The water smells of stone and of the faint organic sweetness of leaves and debris that have washed from the roof and decomposed slowly in the darkness. It is not a bad smell, only a particular smell, the smell of water that has been still for a long time and will remain still for a long time yet. A single drop of condensation falls from the domed ceiling and strikes the surface near the center of the cistern, sending out rings that expand in perfect circles until they reach the walls and reflect back, creating a complex interference pattern that eventually smooths itself back into stillness. The daily routine of water has become the skeleton upon which all other routines are hung. In the morning, before the grey light has fully established itself, the kitchen servants make their first trip to the well with wooden yokes across their shoulders and empty buckets dangling from the hooks. The yokes are worn smooth where they rest against necks and shoulders, and each servant has their own particular way of walking with the load. A slight sway or a careful flat-footed step that minimizes the sloshing and spilling of the precious contents. You have watched them so often that you can identify each servant by their gait alone, even from across the bailey and through the mist that rises from the cobblestones on damp mornings. The water from this first trip is used for the morning porridge, a grey and lumpy substance that has grown greyer and lumpier as the better grains have been consumed, and the remaining sacks yield only the coarser grindings. The water is heated in a great iron pot that hangs from a hook over the kitchen fire, and the steam that rises from it carries the smell of the well, that faint mineral note that seasons everything cooked within these walls. You have grown so accustomed to this taste that you no longer notice it unless you deliberately attend to it, the same way you no longer notice the dripping from the well or the dampness of your cloak or any of the other constant companions of life under siege. The second trip to the well comes at midday, when the light has reached its pale peak and the shadows have shrunk to their smallest extent. This water is used for drinking throughout the afternoon and for the soaking of the dried peas and beans that will become the evening meal. The peas and beans require hours of soaking to become soft enough to eat, and the water in which they soak takes on a greyish colour and a faintly earthy smell that reminds you of the root cellar and the sand in which the carrots sleep. Nothing is wasted here, and the soaking water is eventually added to the pot along with the peas themselves, contributing whatever small nutrition it has absorbed to the general sustenance of the household. The third trick comes in the evening, when the light has faded to the point where the well opening is only a darker patch of darkness against the darkening stones. This water is used for the final cooking of the day and for the small rituals of washing that persist even as resources dwindle. The washing is minimal now, a damp cloth passed over face and hands, the same cloth used by multiple people until it grows grey and must itself be washed in water that has already been used for something else. The hierarchy of water is strict and unspoken, understood by everyone without needing to be explained, and you have learned to navigate it as naturally as you navigate the worn steps of the cistern stair. Between these scheduled trips there are other visits to the well, small adjustments to the day's supply, a bucket drawn for the animals or for the cleaning of a garment that has become intolerably soiled. Each bucket represents a small subtraction from the total that remains below, and though you cannot see the level falling, you feel it in the way the rope must descend slightly further each week, the way the crank requires an extra turn or two to bring the bucket to the surface. The change is so gradual that you might be imagining it, and you have no way to verify your impression except by comparing it to the equally unreliable impressions of others. The rainwater collection system adds another layer to the water calendar, a layer that depends on the weather rather than the steady consumption of the household. The gutters that line the roofs are made of stone in some places and lead in others, and they channel the rain into downspouts that empty into barrels positioned at the corners of the buildings. These barrels fill quickly when the rain comes, which it does with a gentle persistence rather than any dramatic downpour, and the water they collect is softer and cleaner than the cistern water because it has not sat in darkness gathering the flavours of stone and decay. You have learned to read the sky for signs of rain, a skill you did not possess before the gate closed and would not have thought to develop. The clouds above the battlements move in patterns that repeat themselves across days and weeks, and certain configurations promise moisture, while others promise only the continuation of the grey dryness that has become the default condition of the world. When rain does come, it falls in a fine mist that settles onto everything and then gradually intensifies into something that might be called drizzle, and the sound of it on the roof of the great hall becomes a soft percussion that underlies all other sounds and eventually fades from awareness entirely. The barrels at the corners fill slowly, their water levels rising in increments that are visible if you check them at intervals. You have taken to checking them as part of your own small routine, a circuit of the buildings that takes you past each downspout and allows you to note the height of the water against the marks you have scratched into the wood. The marks are shallow and irregular, made with the point of a knife when no one was watching, and they serve the same purpose as the marks on the cistern wall, a record of change that exists outside your unreliable memory. The animals in the stables drink from these rain barrels when they are full, and from the cistern when the barrels run dry. The horses and the single remaining cow and the few sheep that were brought inside when the gate closed have all adjusted to the reduced rations and the changed quality of their water, and they drink with the same patient acceptance that characterizes everything within these walls. You watch them sometimes, noting the way their tongues curl to scoop the water and the way their throats move as they swallow, and you find a certain comfort in the simple mechanics of their existence. The well water and the cistern water and the rain barrel water all taste different, and you've learned to distinguish them by more than just their sources. The well water is cold and hard and leaves a faint coating on the tongue that speaks of minerals dissolved over millennia. The cistern water is soft and slightly stale, carrying the memory of the roof tiles and the lead pipes and the darkness in which it has rested. The rain barrel water is the sweetest of the three, tasting of nothing but water itself and the clean wood of the barrel, and you save it for drinking when you can, hoarding small amounts in a clay cup that you keep near your sleeping place. The dripping in the well continues regardless of your attention, regardless of the buckets drawn or the rain that falls or the slow passage of days that blur into weeks. It is the sound of the castle's heartbeat, a steady affirmation that the spring beneath the keep has not silted up and will continue to provide as long as the stone holds and the earth remains beneath it. You listen to it in the quiet moments between tasks, in the grey light of morning and the deeper grey of evening, and you let it carry you towards sleep with its patient, endless rhythm. Chapter 4. The Rhythm of the Watch. You find yourself on the wall walk of Harwood Castle, in the hour when the grey light of afternoon begins its slow and imperceptible shift toward the deeper grey of evening, though the distinction is so subtle that you could not say with any certainty when one state ends and the other begins. The wall walk is a narrow passage of stone that runs along the top of the curtain wall, connecting the gatehouse turret at one end to the northwest tower at the other, and you have walked its length so many times since the gate closed that your feet know every irregularity in the stone, every slight depression where centuries of boots have worn a shallow channel, every place where the mortar between the stones has crumbled enough to catch the toe of an unwary step. You are not unwary, you have not been unwary for a long time, and your feet adjust themselves automatically to the terrain without requiring any direction from the part of your mind that is still aware of the world around you. The view from the wall walk is the same view you have seen every day since the siege began, and it has changed so little that you sometimes wonder if you are looking at a painting rather than a landscape. The fields below the castle slope away to the south and east, their grass is faded now to a pale brown that catches what little light exists and reflects it back as a sort of dull shimmer. The village that totters at the base of the hill is visible as a collection of low roofs and the spire of the small stone chapel, but no smoke rises from any of the chimneys and no figures move in the lanes between the houses. The people of the village withdrew behind the castle walls when the first rumours of approaching forces arrived, or they scattered into the woods and the outlying farms, and the village has stood empty for so long now that it has begun to take on the appearance of a place that was never inhabited at all. Beyond the village, at a distance that you have measured countless times by the simple method of looking and estimating and then looking again, the besiegers have established their camp. It is not a camp in the sense that you might imagine from tales of war. There are no great pavilions or fluttering banners, or the sound of trumpets and drums. It is simply a collection of tents and lean-tos and cooking fires that have been arranged in a rough semicircle around the approach to the castle gate, and its inhabitants seem to be engaged in the same patient waiting that occupies everyone within the walls. You have watched them for many hours from this vantage, and you have seen nothing that could be called activity. Only the slow drift of smoke from their fires and the occasional movement of a figure walking from one tent to another with the unhurried gait of someone who has nowhere particular to be. The smoke from the besiegers' fires is the only sign that they are still present, and you have come to know its characteristics as well as you know the dripping of the well or the smell of the undercroft. It rises in thin columns that lean with the wind and then dissipate into the general greyness of the sky, and its colour shifts throughout the day from a pale grey in the morning to a slightly darker grey in the afternoon, and finally to an orange-tinged grey in the afternoon, and finally to an orange-tinged grey in the evening when the fires are stoked for the night. You have spent long stretches of your watch simply observing this smoke, noting the way it curls and spreads and vanishes, and you have found in this observation a sort of meditation that occupies the mind without requiring anything from it. The wall walk itself is wide enough for two people to pass if they turn sideways and press against the stone, but you are alone here for most of your watch, and the narrowness of the passage has become a comfort rather than a constraint. The outer edge is lined with crenellations, the alternating blocks of stone and empty space that give the castle its characteristic silhouette when viewed from below, and the gaps between the merlons are just wide enough to allow a clear view of the fields and the camp and the distant line of trees that marks the edge of the forest. You have looked through each of these gaps so many times that you have memorized the particular slice of landscape visible through each one, the slight variations in the placement of the campfires, and the different angles at which the distant hills intersect the horizon. The inner edge of the wall walk is open to the bailey below, and you can look down into the courtyard and observe the slow movements of the household going about their daily routines. The kitchen servants make their trips to the well, the steward emerges from the undercroft with his parchment and his charcoal, the animals in the stables shift and stamp in their stalls. These small activities are the only evidence that time is passing at all, and you have learned to measure the hours by their regular recurrence rather than by any change in the light or the position of the sun, which remains hidden behind the permanent grey blanket that covers the sky. Your watch follows a pattern that has been established by someone long ago and maintained without question by everyone who has stood this post since. You begin at the gatehouse turret, where a small roof chamber provides shelter from the worst of the weather and where a narrow stair leads down to the gate passage below. The turret contains a wooden bench that has been worn smooth by generations of watchmen, and you sit here for a while at the start of your watch, adjusting to the temperature and the light and the particular quality of the silence that hangs over the walls. The silence is not absolute. It is filled with the small sounds that you have come to know as intimately as your own heartbeat. The creak of the windlass from the well, the distant murmur of voices from the great hall, the soft rustle of the wind moving across the stone and through the gaps in the crenellations. When you've sat long enough for your body to accept the stillness, you rise and begin your first circuit of the wall walk. The distance from the gatehouse turret to the northwest tower is exactly 247 paces, a number you have verified so many times that it has become a sort of anchor for your wandering thoughts. Your pace is slow and even, the pace of someone who has nowhere to go and no reason to arrive quickly, and you count the steps without consciously meaning to, a habit that has developed over the weeks of watching and waiting. The numbers rise and fall in your mind like the dripping of the well, steady and meaningless, and somehow soothing in their regularity. The wind on the wall walk is different from the wind in the bailey below, and you have learned to read its variations as a sailor might read the surface of the sea. It comes most often from the west, carrying the smell of the forest and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves, and it finds the gaps in the crenellations and makes a soft humming sound that changes pitch depending on its strength and direction. Sometimes the wind shifts to the north and brings a colder edge, a promise of the winter that is approaching but has not yet arrived, and you pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and feel the weight of the wool settle against your skin. The cloak is heavy and slightly damp, as all things in the castle are slightly damp, and its weight has become so familiar that you would feel incomplete without it. At the midpoint of the wall walk, there is a place where the stone has been repaired at some point in the distant past, and the color of the newer blocks is slightly lighter than the surrounding stone. You always pause here, not because there is anything to see, but because the pause has become part of the rhythm of your circuit, and you lean against the inner edge and look down into the bailey for a while. From this height, you can see the well and the undercroft door and the entrance to the great hall all at once, and you observe the comings and goings of the household with the detached interest of someone watching fish in a pond. The people below do not look up. They are absorbed in their own small routines, and you feel a sort of kinship with them despite the distance that separates you. The second half of the circuit takes you past the remaining crenellations to the northwest tower, which rises another level above the wall walk and offers a slightly different perspective on the landscape. The tower room is small and bare, containing nothing but a narrow window that faces north and west, and a wooden stool that someone has placed beneath it. You sit on this stool sometimes and look out at the forest and the distant hills, which are the same forest and hills you have seen every day of your watch, and which have not changed in any way that you can detect. The trees are bare now, their branches forming a grey lace against the grey sky, and you can see further into the woods than you could when the leaves were still attached. There is nothing to see in those depths but more trees and the occasional movement of a deer or a fox going about its own patient business, and you watch these small signs of life with the same quiet attention you give to everything else. From the northwest tower you can also see a section of the besiegers' camp that is hidden from the rest of the wall walk, a cluster of tents arranged around a larger structure that might be a command tent or might simply be a place where supplies are stored. The figures who move among these tents are too distant to distinguish as individuals, and you have given up trying to count them or identify any patterns in their movements. They are simply present, a fact of the landscape like the trees and the hills, and you observe them without expectation or concern. The smoke from their fires rises and disperses, the figures walk from tent to tent, the grey sky presses down on everything equally. The return circuit from the northwest tower to the gatehouse turret covers the same 247 paces in reverse, and you notice different details on this leg of the journey. The stone beneath your feet shows different patterns of wear, the gaps between the merlons frame different slices of the landscape, the wind hits your face from a different angle and carries different sounds. You have come to know these differences as well as you know the samenesses, and you find a certain satisfaction in the way the familiar reveals new aspects of itself when approached from another direction. There is a particular stone near the gatehouse end of the wall walk that has a small fossil embedded in its surface, the spiral shell of some creature that lived and died long before this castle was built, long before anyone thought to build anything on this hilltop. You discovered this fossil during your first week of watch, and you have made a point of touching it each time you pass, running your finger over the delicate ridges of the spiral and feeling the cool smoothness of the ancient stone. The fossil does not change, it has not changed for millions of years, and its permanence is a comfort against the slow but perceptible changes that are occurring everywhere else within the walls. The hours of your watch pass in this fashion, circuits and pauses and the long still intervals when you simply stand in one place and let your gaze rest on the landscape without focusing on any particular feature. Your mind wanders during these intervals, touching on memories of times before the gate closed and then drifting away again without following any particular thread to its conclusion. You think about the taste of fresh bread, which you can no longer quite remember with accuracy, and about the sound of the gate opening, which you have not heard for so long that you are no longer certain you would recognize it. These thoughts come and go like the clouds above, passing through your awareness without leaving any mark, and you let them pass without resistance. The light changes so slowly that you are never aware of the moment when afternoon becomes evening, only that at some point you look up and realize that the grey has deepened to a shade that requires more effort to see through. The campfires of the besiegers become more visible as the sky darkens, small orange points of light that flicker and sway with the movement of the air, and you watch them with the same patient attention you have given to everything else. The fires are arranged in a pattern that you have memorized, and you note without concern that one of them has moved slightly since the previous evening, shifted perhaps by a change in the wind or the preference of whoever tends it. The watch passes from you to another, when the light has faded to the point where the distinction between the wall and the sky is no longer clear, and you descend the narrow stair from the gatehouse turret to the bailey below. Your legs are stiff from the hours of standing and slow walking, and you move with the careful deliberation of someone whose body has grown accustomed to the particular demands of the wall walk. The bailey feels different after a watch, more enclosed and more sheltered, and the sounds of the household preparing for the evening meal seem louder and more immediate than they did from above. You carry the memory of the wall walk with you as you move through the evening routines, the 247 paces, the fossil in the stone, the pattern of the campfires, the way the wind hums through the crenellations. These details have become part of you, as much a part of you as the taste of the well water and the smell of the undercroft, and they will accompany you into sleep and be waiting for you when you wake. Tomorrow you will climb the stair again and begin another watch, and the landscape will be unchanged, and the smoke will rise from the same fires, and the wind will hum the same tuneless song through the gaps in the stone. And this sameness, this perfect, unbroken repetition, is the only thing you need. Chapter 5. The The fading of the rushlights. You notice the darkness before you notice anything else, the way a fish might notice the water only when it begins to grow shallow and warm. The great hall of Harwood Castle has always been a place of shadows. Its high timber roof lost in bloom even on the brightest days, its corners receding into obscurity that the central hearth could never fully dispel. But the shadows now are different in quality, if not in degree, denser somehow, and more patient, as though they have recognized their opportunity and are pressing inward from the walls with a slow confidence that requires no urgency. The reason for this change is simple and unavoidable, and understood by everyone without needing to be stated. The oil is nearly gone, the wax is nearly gone, and the tallow that remains must be stretched across weeks that have not yet arrived and cannot be predicted with any certainty. You have watched this fading occur in increments so small that each individual diminishment passes unnoticed, like the retreat of the cistern water or the lowering of the grain sacks in the undercroft. Only when you pause to compare the present to a memory that has grown soft and unreliable do you perceive the change. The lamp that once burned steadily through the evening meal now gutters and smokes and must be extinguished before the hour grows truly late, its reservoir of oil reduced to a thin film that barely wets the wick. The candles that stood in iron holders along the tables have been gathered and stored away, except for a single pair that are lit only when someone must read or write, or perform some task that cannot be accomplished by touch and memory alone. The great iron cresset that hangs from the central beam, a wheel of spikes meant to hold a dozen oil lamps, has stood dark and empty for so long that the spiders have begun to weave their webs between its spokes, secure in the knowledge that no flame will come to destroy their patient work. The hearth fire remains, and has become the center of all life within the great hall, in a way that it was not before the oil and wax began their slow retreat into memory. The fire is fed with wood that has been seasoned for years in the lean-to behind the stables, logs of oak and ash and beech that burn slowly and produce a steady heat without excessive flame. The woodpile is finite, and has been measured and recorded by the steward with the same careful attention he gives to the grain sacks and the salted fish, and each log that is placed upon the fire represents a small subtraction from a total that cannot be replenished until the gate opens and the forest can be reached again. You have learned to read the steward's face when he visits the woodpile, noting the slight tightening around his eyes that indicates the rate of consumption is slightly ahead of the rate he had planned for, and you have begun to sit a little farther from the hearth and wrap your cloak a little tighter rather than suggest that another log be added. The light from the hearth is different from the light of lamps and candles, warmer in color and more variable in its reach, and it transforms the great hall into a place you are still learning to inhabit. The flames rise and fall with the shifting of the logs and the movement of the air, and the shadows they cast are alive in a way that the steady shadows of oil lamps never were. A single figure walking between the hearth and the far wall will send great dark shapes sweeping across the timber ceiling and down the opposite wall, shapes that stretch and compress and merge with one another in a slow dance that has no choreographer and no audience beyond those who happen to be watching. You have spent long portions of the evening simply observing this dance, noting the way a raised arm becomes a bird, or a stooped back becomes a bear, or a bundle of carried rushes becomes a strange hunched creature that exists only for a moment and then dissolves into the general darkness. The making of rushlights has become an evening occupation for many of those who gather in the great hall, a task that requires just enough attention to occupy the hands while leaving the mind free to wander or to rest entirely. The rushes themselves are gathered from the marshy ground beyond the outer ditch, long straight stems that have been dried and peeled and cut to uniform lengths. You have seen bundles of these rushes stored in the undercroft near the door, their pale surfaces catching what little light exists and glowing faintly like the bones of some delicate creature. The process of transforming a dried rush into a source of light is simple and ancient and has been performed by countless hands in countless winters before this one, and you find a certain comfort in the continuity of the gesture. The tallow used for the rushlights comes from the kitchen, where the fat from cooked meat is collected and rendered and stored in clay pots that have been sealed with a layer of cooled grease. This tallow is not the pure white substance that fills the better candles. It is greyish and granular, and carries the faint smell of all the meals that have contributed to its accumulation. You have grown accustomed to this smell, just as you have grown accustomed to the smell of the undercroft and the taste of the well water and all the other sensory companions of life under siege, and you no longer notice it unless you deliberately bring your attention to it. The tallow is melted in a small pot that sits at the edge of the hearth, and the rushes are drawn through the liquid one by one and then laid aside to cool and harden. The motion of drawing a rush through melted tallow is repetitive and soothing in the way that all such motions become when performed often enough. You hold the rush at one end and lower it into the pot, feeling the slight resistance of the liquid fat against the fibers, and then you draw it out slowly so that the tallow has time to adhere in an even layer. The rush emerges glossy and warm and slightly darker than it was before, and you lay it on a flat stone that has been placed near the hearth for this purpose. The tallow cools quickly and takes on a matte finish, and the completed rushlight is added to a growing pile that will be stored in a basket near the door for use in the coming days. A single rushlight burns for perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, producing a flame that is small and yellow and inclined to flicker with every movement of the air. The light it casts is barely sufficient to illuminate the immediate vicinity, a small circle of visibility that fades quickly into the general darkness of the great hall. You have learned to position yourself carefully when you light a rushlight, placing it so that its small radiance falls where you need it and nowhere else, conserving the brief life of the flame for the specific task at hand. When the task is complete, you extinguish the rushlight by pinching the flame between your fingers, a gesture that leaves a small smudge of soot on your skin and the faint smell of burnt tallow that lingers for hours. The evenings in the great hall have grown longer as the light has grown scarcer, not because the hours themselves have stretched, but because the darkness arrives earlier and departs later, and the period of useful illumination shrinks with each passing week. You have adjusted to this new rhythm in the way that you have adjusted to everything else, by letting go of the expectation that things should be otherwise and accepting the conditions as they are. The evening meal is now eaten in near darkness, the faces of those around you visible only as pale suggestions in the glow of the hearth, their features lost to shadow and their expressions readable only through the tone of their voices and the small movements of their bodies. The voices themselves have changed in ways that you can perceive but not easily describe. They are softer than they were, pitched lower and with less variation, as though everyone has unconsciously agreed to conserve the energy that would be required for more animated speech. The silences between words have grown longer, and these silences are no longer uncomfortable or awkward, but simply the natural pauses in a conversation that has all the time in the world to reach its conclusion. You have listened to these quiet voices for so many hours that you have learned to distinguish each member of the household by the particular quality of their silence, as much as by the sound of their speech. The tasks that occupy the long dark hours are the tasks that can be performed by touch and memory rather than by sight. Someone mends a tear in a woolen tunic, their needle finding the fabric and the thread finding the needle with a certainty that comes from years of practice rather than any visual guidance. Someone else whittles at a piece of dry wood with a small knife, producing not any particular object, but simply the long curling shavings that pile up at their feet and will eventually be added to the hearth as kindling. A third person sits with their hands folded in their lap and their eyes closed, not sleeping, but resting in that state between awareness and unawareness that fills so many of the hours now. You have spent time in each of these occupations and you have found that they all lead to the same destination, a quiet emptying of the mind that is not quite sleep but shares its restorative quality. The hearth fire requires tending throughout the evening, and this duty passes from person to person in an unspoken rotation that everyone understands without needing to discuss. When your turn comes, you rise from your place and move to the hearth, feeling the warmth intensify against your face and hands as you approach. The fire is a living thing that requires attention but not urgency, and you adjust the logs with a long iron poker, pushing them into arrangements that will burn steadily through the next hour. The wood shifts and settles, releasing showers of sparks that rise into the chimney and disappear, and the flames respond to the new arrangement by brightening briefly before settling back into their steady consumption. You sometimes remain at the hearth longer than is strictly necessary, not because you are avoiding any other duty, but because the warmth and the light and the simple presence of the flames offer a comfort that is difficult to find elsewhere in the darkened hall. The fire speaks in a language of crackles and hisses and the soft roar that underlies everything, and you have learned to listen to this language without trying to translate it into anything more meaningful. The flames are orange and yellow and sometimes blue at their base where the wood is hottest, and they move in patterns that never repeat exactly, but always remain within a certain range of variation. Watching these patterns is like watching the smoke from the besiegers' campfires or the dripping of the well, an activity that occupies the surface of the mind while allowing the depths to rest. The children of the household have adapted to the darkness more quickly than the adults, as children always adapt more quickly to any change that is presented as normal rather than as a deviation. They play games that require no light, clapping games and guessing games, and long rambling stories that they invent as they go along and abandon when they lose interest. Their voices rise and fall in the darkness, high and clear, and somehow untouched by the weight that presses on everyone else, and you listen to them with a feeling that you cannot quite name. They are the only ones who still laugh easily, and their laughter sounds strange in the muffled acoustics of the darkened hall, like the calls of birds who have not yet learned that winter is coming. The rushlights are used sparingly and for specific purposes, and you have learned to hoard their brief illumination the way you hoard the rainwater from the barrels. When someone must read from the single book that the household possesses, a worn volume of devotions that has been passed down through generations, a rushlight is lit and placed carefully beside the reader, so that the small flame falls directly on the page. The reader's voice is low and steady, and the words are familiar to everyone who has heard them repeated through countless evenings, and the sound of the voice combined with the flicker of the tiny flame creates a small island of light and meaning in the vast darkness of the hall. The book itself is bound in leather that has grown soft and dark with age, and its pages are yellowed and fragile and must be turned with great care. The reader knows this and turns each page slowly, pausing to smooth the paper against the binding before continuing. You have watched this ritual so many times that you could describe every detail of it, the way the reader's thumb finds the edge of the page, the way the page lifts and settles, the way the rushlight flame bends toward the movement and then straightens again. These small observations are the texture of your evenings now, and you collect them the way the steward collects his marks on parchment, building a record of a world that has contracted to the circle of warmth and shadow around the hearth. The hour when the hearth fire is allowed to burn down to embers arrives without announcement, signaled only by a general sense that the evening has run its course and nothing more can be expected of it. The last log is not replaced, and the flames gradually subside into a bed of glowing coals that cast a dim red light across the nearest faces and leave everything else to the darkness. This is the hour when people begin to drift toward their sleeping places, rising slowly and moving through the hall with the careful steps of those who have learned to navigate by memory rather than sight. The sounds of settling bodies and rustling straw and the soft murmur of final words exchanged in the darkness are the last sounds of the day, and they fade one by one until only the hiss of the dying embers remains. You remain by the hearth longer than most, watching the coals shift from red to grey and feeling the warmth diminish in gradual stages. The darkness in the hall is nearly complete now, broken only by the faint glow from the embers and the even fainter suggestion of moonlight that sometimes filters through the high window when the clouds are thin enough to permit it. This darkness is not frightening or oppressive. It is simply the natural state of the world during the hours when the sun has gone and the artificial lights have been extinguished. You have come to appreciate its quality, the way it erases the distinctions between things and allows the mind to rest from the constant work of seeing and interpreting. The fading of the rushlights has taught you something about light that you did not know before, something about its relationship to time and attention, and the way a day is shaped by the sources of illumination available to it. The old rhythm of waking with the sun and sleeping with the dark has reasserted itself, not as a choice, but as a necessity. And you have found that your body remembers this rhythm even if your conscious mind had forgotten it. You sleep more deeply now than you did when lamps burned late into the night, and you wake more naturally when the first grey light begins to seep through the high window. The days feel longer and shorter at the same time, stretched by the hours of darkness and compressed by the hours of useful light, and you have stopped trying to reconcile these contradictory sensations. The basket of completed rushlights grows slowly as the evenings pass, each new addition representing a small investment in future illumination. You handle the finished rushlights carefully, noting the slight variations in their thickness and the way the tallow has pooled differently on each one. They are fragile things and temporary things, and they will be consumed one by one until the basket is empty and the process must begin again. This cycle of making and using and making again is the rhythm of life within the walls, and you have found your place within it, your hands remembering the motions even as your mind drifts elsewhere, your eyes adjusting to the darkness that has become not an absence, but a presence in its own right. Chapter 6. The scent of stone and straw. You become aware of the smell of Harwood Castle not as a sudden revelation but as a slow and patient accumulation, the way a stone wall becomes damp or a barrel of brine deepens in character over months of stillness. The smell has been there since the gate closed. Of course it has been there all along, but only now that the weeks have stretched into a span that can no longer be counted easily on two hands. Do you find yourself attending to it with the same quiet focus you have given to the dripping of the well, and the fading of the rushlights, and the slow inventory of the undercroft? It is the smell of a place that has been sealed against the outside world, a place where the air moves only in the smallest currents, and where everything that enters remains until it is consumed or worn away or simply absorbed into the fabric of the walls. The stables are the source of the most insistent note in this complex fragrance, a warm and ammoniac presence that rises from the packed earth floor and drifts up the narrow turnpike stair that connects the lower bailey to the living quarters above. The animals have been confined for so long now that their smell has become a permanent feature of the castle's atmosphere, as fixed and unchanging as the grey sky beyond the arrow loops. The horses stamp and shift in their stalls, their great bodies generating heat and moisture, and the particular odour of large creatures who were meant to move across open ground and now must content themselves with standing and waiting. The breath rises in plumes that you can see on the coldest mornings, and it carries the sweet scent of the hay that is now rationed as carefully as the grain and the water and everything else within these walls. The hay itself has its own smell, a dry and dusty fragrance that speaks of summer meadows, and the cutting of grass under a sun that seems now like something from a story told to children. You notice the hay smell most strongly when a fresh armful is carried from the dwindling stack to the stalls, and for a brief moment the ammoniac weight of the stable air is lifted by this memory of the outside world before the older smells reassert themselves and the moment passes. The straw that covers the floors of the sleeping alcoves in the great hall has not been changed since the feast day that occurred before the gate closed, and its smell has evolved through several distinct stages that you can trace in your memory if you choose to. The first stage was the clean, dry smell of fresh straw, golden and slightly sweet and full of the memory of the fields where it grew. The second stage arrived after a few weeks of feet and bodies and the gradual accumulation of dust and crumbs and the small debris of daily life, and it brought a musty undertone that was not unpleasant, but simply different, the smell of organic material beginning its slow return to the earth. The third stage is the one that surrounds you now, a deep and settled odour that has become so familiar that you no longer notice it unless you bend close to the floor or disturb a section that has been undisturbed for a long time. When you do disturb the straw, a richer smell rises, earthier and more complex, and you understand without being told that the straw is slowly composting beneath the weight of the household, transforming from one thing into another at a pace too slow to observe. The stone itself has a smell that you had never noticed before the gate closed, or perhaps you noticed it but did not attend to it because there were so many other smells competing for your attention. Now that the outside air no longer sweeps through the open gate and the high windows, the smell of the stone has emerged as the foundation upon which all other scents are built. It is a clean smell, but not a sharp one, a mineral presence that speaks of deep time and the slow cooling of the earth's bones and the patient work of water seeping through cracks and fissures over centuries. The limestone of which the castle is built is particularly receptive to moisture, and the dampness that pervades every surface has drawn out a faint chalky sweetness that you can taste on the back of your tongue when you breathe deeply. This sweetness is more pronounced in some places than others, stronger in the undercroft where the walls are always wet to the touch, and fainter in the upper chambers where the air is slightly drier. You have learned to read the stone by its smell as much as by its appearance, and you know without looking which parts of the castle are weeping moisture today, and which are merely damp in their ordinary fashion. The combination of these smells, the ammonia from the stables, and the mustiness of the straw and the mineral sweetness of the damp stone has created a single unified atmosphere that fills every corner of the castle and follows you wherever you go. It is the smell of the siege itself, the smell of a community that has turned inward and is living on its own resources, and you have grown so accustomed to it that you can no longer imagine the world smelling any other way. When you think of the time before the gate closed, you remember the smell of the outside air and the smell of cooking that drifted from the village and the smell of the forest after rain. But these memories have grown faint and unreliable, like the memory of fresh bread or the sound of the gate opening, and you are no longer certain that they correspond to anything real. The dust motes that hang in the shafts of light entering through the narrow windows have become a source of quiet fascination for you during the long, still hours when there is nothing else that requires your attention. The windows themselves are little more than slits in the stone, designed for defense rather than illumination, and the light that passes through them arrives as a thin blade that cuts across the darkness of the interior and illuminates a single slice of air and floor and wall. The dust motes are visible only within this blade of light, countless tiny particles suspended in the still air and moving with a slowness that makes the drifting of clouds seem hurried by comparison. Each mote is a fragment of something, a bit of dried straw, or a flake of skin, or a grain of flour from the kitchen, or a speck of ash from the hearth, and together they form a constellation that shifts and reforms with each small movement of the air. You have spent long periods simply watching these dust motes, noting the way they rise and fall in currents that are too subtle to feel against your skin, the way they catch the light and glow for a moment before passing into shadow and disappearing. The pattern of their movement is never the same from one moment to the next, and yet it never changes in any way that matters, and this combination of variation and constancy has become a sort of anchor for your wandering thoughts. You've noticed that the dust motes are thicker near the floor and thinner near the ceiling, that they congregate in the corners where the air is stillest, that they are disturbed by the passage of a body through the beam of light, and then slowly settle back into their previous arrangement over the course of many minutes. These observations have no practical value. They will not help you conserve water or stretch the grain supply or predict when the gate might open, and perhaps that is precisely why you find them so restful. They are observations made for their own sake, attending to the world as it is, rather than as it might be used. The sweeping of the floor has become a daily ritual that you perform or observe or simply hear from a distance, the soft, rhythmic sound of a broom made of twigs moving across the flagstones. The broom itself is a simple thing, a bundle of birch twigs bound to a wooden handle with strips of leather that have been soaked and dried and soaked again, until they have shrunk tight around the wood. The twigs are worn at their ends from countless passages across the same stones, and they have taken on a polish that catches the light when the broom is lifted. The sound they make against the flagstones is a soft whisking that varies slightly depending on the pressure applied and the texture of the stone beneath, and you have learned to identify the person doing the sweeping by the particular rhythm of their strokes. Some sweepers work quickly with short, brisk movements that send small clouds of dust rising from the floor, while others sweep slowly with long, deliberate strokes that gather the debris into neat piles with minimal disturbance. You prefer the slow sweepers, not because they do a better job, but because their rhythm is more conducive to the state of quiet attention that has become your default condition. The flagstones themselves have been worn smooth by centuries of feet and sweeping in the simple passage of time, and they have developed a patina that is visible only in certain lights. When the blade of light from the window falls across the floor at a low angle, you can see the slight depressions where countless steps have pressed the stone down over generations, the faint scratches where heavy objects were dragged from one place to another, the darker spots where spills were absorbed and never fully cleaned. The flagstones are a record of the castle's history, written in a language that no one can read but everyone can feel under their feet. A texture of accumulated time that speaks of all the lives that have passed across these stones, and all the lives that have passed across these stones, and all the lives that will pass across them after you are gone. The smell of the castle is strongest in the morning when you first wake, and your senses have been refreshed by sleep and the temporary absence of awareness. You lie in your sleeping place, a narrow alcove off the great hall where a straw pallet and a wool blanket constitute the entirety of your private domain, and you breathe in the complex air and identify its components one by one. The ammonia from the stables has risen during the night, warmed by the bodies of the animals and the slow fermentation of their bedding, and it reaches you as a faint sharpness at the back of your nose. The mustiness of the straw is closer, rising from your own palate and from the floor beneath it, and it has a sweetness that you have come to associate with the approach of sleep. The mineral breath of the stone surrounds everything, cool and clean and utterly indifferent to your presence. You lie still and breathe and let the smells wash over you, and eventually you rise and begin the day. The kitchen adds its own notes to the castle's fragrance when the morning fire is lit and the pot is hung, and the first meal of the day begins its slow transformation from raw ingredients into something that can be eaten. The smell of cooking grain is mild and slightly nutty, and it drifts through the hall and mingles with the other smells without overwhelming them. The smell of the hearth fire itself is present throughout the day, a dry woody scent that varies depending on what is being burned, oak or ash or beech or the smaller branches that have been gathered and dried for kindling. You have learned to distinguish these woods by their smoke, the sharp, clean smell of ash, and the sweeter, heavier smell of oak, and the faint spice of beech, and you note without conscious intention which wood is being burned on any given day. The people of the household have their own smells too, though these are fainter and more variable than the smells of the castle itself. The washing of bodies and clothing has been reduced to the minimum that dignity and health require, and everyone carries with them a faint odor of wool and sweat and the particular scent of their own skin. You have grown accustomed to these human smells, just as you have grown accustomed to everything else, and you no longer distinguish between the smell of one person and another unless you are very close to them. When someone passes near you in the narrow corridor or sits beside you at the hearth, you receive a brief impression of their individual fragrance, a combination of their work and their sleeping place, and the food they've eaten, and the simple fact of their existence. These impressions fade quickly and leave no trace, and you could not describe them if asked. The afternoon light is different from the morning light, entering through different windows at different angles and illuminating different portions of the floor and walls. You have learned to read the time of day by the position of these light blades, by which stones are lit and which remain in shadow, by the length of the shadows cast by the window bars across the flagstones. The dust motes are visible in the afternoon light, as they were in the morning light, but they seem to move more slowly now, as though the day has grown tired and is conserving its energy for the evening. You watch them drift and settle and rise again, and you feel your own thoughts slowing to match their pace. The evening brings a change to the castle's smell that is subtle but perceptible if you are paying attention. The hearth fire has been burning all day, and its smoke has filled the upper reaches of the hall with a haze that softens the edges of the timber beams and makes the shadow seem deeper and more patient. The smell of the evening meal is stronger than the morning meal, more complex and more varied, though the ingredients are largely the same and only the proportions and the cooking time distinguish one from the other. The smell of the tallow that is melted for the rushlights adds its own note, a faint greasiness that lingers in the air long after the rushlights have been extinguished. And underneath all of these evening smells, the fundamental odor of the castle remains unchanged. The ammonia and the must and the mineral dampness that have become the background of your existence. You have noticed that the smell of the castle is strongest in the turnpike stair, the narrow spiral that connects the great hall to the chambers above and below. The stair is enclosed by stone on all sides and has no windows of its own, and the air within it moves only when someone passes through and stirs it into brief motion. The smells from all parts of the castle collect here and mingle and concentrate, and when you climb the stair you pass through layers of fragrance that tell the story of the building from bottom to top. The lowest turns smell of the undercroft and the earth, the middle turns smell of the great hall and the hearth and the straw, and the highest turns smell of the roof timbers and the faint fresh air that leaks through the gaps in the stonework. You have climbed this stair so many times that you no longer notice the transitions, but you know that they are there, and you could find them if you chose to attend to them. The nights are the quietest time for smells, because the hearth fire is burned down and the cooking is done, and the bodies of the household are still and silent in their sleeping places. The smells of the castle settle into a stable arrangement, the heavier odors sinking toward the floor and the lighter ones rising toward the ceiling, and nothing disturbs them until the first movements of the morning. You lie in the darkness and breathe the air of this arrangement, and you feel the weight of the stone above you and the straw beneath you and the slow respiration of the animals in the stables below. The smell of the castle is the smell of a world that has stopped and is waiting, and you are part of that waiting, and that is enough. Chapter 7. The softening of the grindstone. You find yourself in the armory of Harwood Castle, on a morning that is indistinguishable from the morning before it, and the morning that will follow. The same grey light seeping through the same high narrow slit in the stone, the same cool dampness rising from the packed earth floor, the same patient silence that has settled over everything within these walls, like dust on an unused surface. The armory is a small chamber tucked into the base of the northwest tower, accessible only through a low door that requires you to duck your head and turn your shoulders slightly to pass, and you have come here without any particular purpose beyond the simple fact that your feet have carried you this way, and there is no reason to turn them in another direction. The room contains the tools of a trade that is not currently being practiced, the instruments of a craft that has been suspended by the closing of the gate and the nature of the siege that has followed, and you have learned to find a certain quiet fascination in the way these objects wait for a use that may never come. The walls of the armory are lined with wooden racks that hold an assortment of weapons arranged not for display but for accessibility, though no one has accessed them for anything beyond the routine of maintenance since the gate closed. There are spears standing upright in a barrel near the door, their ash shafts darkened by the oils of countless hands, and their iron heads wrapped in oiled cloth to slow the rust that is always seeking a foothold in this damp climate. There are swords hanging from pegs driven into the stone, their blades protected by leather sheaths that have grown stiff and cracked in the dry cold of winter and the damp warmth of summer and the long grey stillness of the siege. There are shields stacked against the far wall, their wooden faces painted with devices that have faded to suggestions of colour and shape, their leather straps hanging loose and curling at the edges where the moisture has worked its slow transformation. And in the centre of the room, on a low bench that has been worn smooth by generations of seated weight, there is a grindstone mounted on an iron frame, its surface grey and gritty and patient. The grindstone is the heart of the armory in the same way that the well is the heart of the bailey, and the hearth is the heart of the great hall, a centre around which the other objects arrange themselves in orbits of varying distance. It is a wheel of sandstone approximately the width of your hand and the diameter of your arm's reach, and it has been shaped by use into a circle that is almost but not quite perfect. A slight flattening on one side where some long ago armourer favoured a particular angle or simply grew tired and let the stone wear unevenly. The surface of the stone is pitted and grooved from the passage of countless blades, and the grit that covers it is a mixture of the stone's own substance and the fine particles of iron that have been ground away over years and decades and centuries. This grit has accumulated in a grey mound beneath the wheel, spreading outward in a fan shape that reaches toward the door, and you have noticed that the mound grows very slowly now, almost imperceptibly, because the wheel turns so rarely and the blades are sharpened only when the routine of maintenance demands it, rather than when actual use has dulled an edge. The armourer is present as he always is at this hour, a man whose name you know but rarely speak, because there is so little that needs to be said between people who've shared the same space for months of waiting. He sits on the bench beside the grindstone with a sword laid across his knees, the blade bare and gleaming faintly in the grey light, and he runs a square of oiled cloth along its length with a slow and methodical motion that you have watched so many times you could reproduce it in your sleep. The cloth moves from hilt to point and back again, gathering the thin film of rust that has bloomed since the last oiling and leaving behind a surface that is slightly brighter than before, though the difference is so subtle that you would not notice it if you had not been watching with the particular attention that comes from having nothing else to watch. The oil he uses is the same oil that once filled the lamps and now is hoarded for this single purpose, a thin golden liquid that smells of seeds and pressing stones, and a summer that seems impossibly distant. He applies it sparingly, just enough to coat the blade without wasting a single drop, and the smell of it rises and mingles with the mineral smell of the stone and the faint sharp smell of iron that always hangs in the air of the armory. The sword he holds is a plain weapon without ornament or distinction, a blade that was forged for use rather than display, and has seen enough use to develop a patina of small scratches and shallow nicks that catch the light in different ways. You have examined this sword before, running your finger along its edge and feeling the places where it has been sharpened so many times that the steel has grown thin and delicate. And you have wondered without any particular urgency about the hands that held it, and the purposes for which it was drawn, and the blood that may or may not have stained its surface before being wiped away, and oiled and forgotten. These are not thoughts that lead anywhere. They are simply the thoughts that arise when you sit in a quiet room and look at an object that has existed for longer than you have been alive and will continue to exist after you are gone. The armorer does not wonder about such things, or if he does, he gives no sign of it, and he continues his slow work with the cloth while you settle onto a low stool near the door and let the silence of the room settle around you. The sound of the armory is different from the sounds of the other chambers you have come to know so well. There is no dripping here, as there is in the well and the cistern, no crackling of flames as there is in the great hall, no soft stamping of hooves as there is in the stables. The silence here is nearly complete, broken only by the faint whisper of the cloth against the steel, and the even fainter sound of your own breathing. This silence has a quality that you have learned to appreciate, a density and a patience that seems to emanate from the weapons themselves, from the iron and steel and wood that were shaped for a purpose that is not currently being fulfilled and may never be fulfilled within these walls. The weapons are waiting, and you are waiting, and the armorer is waiting, and the waiting itself has become a kind of activity that fills the hours without requiring anything more than presence. After a time, the armorer finishes his work with the cloth and sets the sword aside on a second bench that holds several other blades in various states of maintenance. He reaches for another sword, this one still sheathed in leather that has grown dark with age and the absorption of oil, and he draws it slowly from its scabbard with a sound that is soft and smooth and somehow final, the sound of a blade being revealed to a light that will ask nothing of it, being revealed to a light that will ask nothing of it. The blade is duller than the first, its surface mottled with patches of rust that have begun to eat into the steel in small irregular circles, and the armorer examines it for a long moment with the expression of someone who is calculating not the cost of repair but the amount of oil and effort that will be required to arrest the slow decay. He sets the scabbard aside and reaches for a small pot of oil and a fresh cloth, and the work begins again. The same slow motion repeated with the same patient attention. You watch him work and you think about the rust, about the way it appears so slowly that you cannot see it spreading from one day to the next, but so persistently that you cannot deny its presence when you compare the present state of a blade to your memory of its state a month ago. The rust is a kind of siege in miniature, a slow occupation of the surface by forces that are too small to see and too numerous to resist. And the armorer's work is a defense that can never be fully successful, but must be maintained regardless. He pushes back the rust with oil and cloth and the occasional touch of the whetstone, and the rust retreats, but does not surrender, waiting in the damp air and the porous stone and the very breath of the people who inhabit this place. You have seen rust on the iron bands of the gate and the hinges of the undercroft door and the crank of the well, and you've accepted it as you've accepted everything else, as a condition of existence rather than a problem to be solved. The whetstone turns only rarely now, and when it does turn, the sound it makes is the sound of the castle itself being slowly reshaped, a low grinding that vibrates through the bench and the floor and into the soles of your feet. The armorer uses the stone when a blade has grown too dull for the cloth alone to restore, or when a nick in the edge requires the removal of enough steel to create a smooth curve again. He sits at the bench with his feet on the treadle that drives the wheel and his hands guiding the blade against the spinning stone, and the sound rises and fills the small chamber and spills out through the low door into the bailey beyond. The sound is not loud. It is too low and too steady to be called loud, but it is pervasive in a way that the dripping of the well is pervasive, a presence that you feel as much as hear. You have noticed that the sound of the grindstone carries further than you would expect, reaching up the turnpike stair and into the great hall, and even to the wall walk if the wind is right, and you have wondered, without urgency, whether the besiegers in their camp can hear it too, and what they make of it if they can. The leather straps that hold the shields and secure the scabbards and bind the grips of the swords are suffering from the same slow decay that affects everything organic within the walls. The dampness that preserves the stone and feeds the rust and permeates the straw is not kind to leather, and you have watched the armorer work oil into these straps as well, rubbing it into the fibers with his thumbs and flexing the leather to work the oil deep into the places where it is most needed. The leather darkens under the oil and becomes supple again for a time, but the dampness is patient and the oil is finite, and you can see the straps slowly stiffening and cracking despite the armorer's best efforts. This is not a crisis, it is simply the way of things, the slow transformation of one substance into another that occurs everywhere in the castle, at a pace too slow to observe directly. The shields stacked against the far wall are perhaps the saddest objects in the armory, though sadness is not a quality that you would normally ascribe to wood and leather and paint. They lean against one another in a long row, their faces turned toward the wall so that only their backs are visible, and their straps hang down like the arms of people who have grown tired and let their hands fall to their sides. The wood of the shields is laminated from thin layers that have been glued and pressed and shaped into curves designed to deflect blows that are not coming and may never come, and the edges are bound with rawhide that has shrunk and hardened and begun to pull away from the wood in places. You have lifted one of these shields once, feeling its weight and the way it balanced on your arm, and you were surprised by how heavy it was and how awkward it felt, as though it had been designed for a body that was not yours and a purpose that you could not fully imagine. You set it back carefully against its companions and left it to its waiting. The armorer finishes the second sword and sets it with the first, and then he rises from the bench and stretches his back with a slow and careful motion that speaks of hours spent in the same position and muscles that have grown stiff from the inactivity of his trade. He moves to the barrel of spears and runs his hand over the wrapped heads, feeling for the texture of rust through the oiled cloth, and he finds a place where the cloth has worn thin, and the iron beneath has begun to bloom with the familiar orange-brown stain. He unwraps the head and examines it in the grey light, turning it this way and that, and then he reaches for a small file that lies on the bench among the other tools and begins to work at the rust with short, careful strokes. The sound of the file against the iron is higher and thinner than the sound of the grindstone, a scratching that is almost musical in its regularity, and it joins the other sounds of the armory in a slow and patient chorus. You notice a wooden chest in the corner of the armory that you have not paid attention to before. A simple box bound with iron straps and fitted with a heavy lock that hangs open from its hasp. The armorer sees the direction of your gaze and nods slightly, a gesture that might be permission or might simply be the acknowledgement of a shared awareness, and you rise from your stool and cross the room to look inside. The chest contains the smaller pieces of the garrison's equipment, the buckles and rivets and leather cords and spare links of mail that are kept against the day when something breaks and must be repaired. The mail links are particularly fascinating to you. Small rings of iron that have been woven together into a fabric that is both flexible and strong, and you lift a handful and let them trickle through your fingers with a soft chiming sound that is the brightest note you have heard in weeks. The links are dull with age and the beginnings of rust, and they will need to be rolled in a barrel with sand and oil to clean them if they are ever to be used, but for now they simply lie in the chest and wait. The armorer returns to his bench and selects a third blade, this one a short dagger with a worn grip of wrapped leather that has been darkened by the sweat of countless palms. He does not oil this blade immediately, but instead carries it to the grindstone and sits down at the treadle, adjusting his position until he is comfortable and the angle of the blade against the stone feels right to him. He begins to turn the wheel with his feet, slowly at first and then with a steady rhythm that you have learned to recognize, and he brings the blade to the spinning stone with the care of someone who has done this 10,000 times and knows exactly how much pressure to apply and how long to hold it. The sound of the grinding fills the room again, low and steady and somehow soothing, and you watch the tiny sparks that fly from the edge of the blade and die in the grey light before they can reach the floor. The sparkles are the only bright things in the armory, brief flashes of orange and gold that appear and vanish in the space of a heartbeat, and you find yourself watching for them and feeling a small satisfaction when they appear. The work continues for a long time, or perhaps only for a short time, that feels long because there is nothing else to measure it against. The armorer sharpens the dagger, and then another sword, and then a spearhead that has been removed from its shaft for this purpose. And you sit on your stool and watch and listen, and let your thoughts drift in the same slow circles as the grindstone. You think about the iron that makes up these weapons, about the ore that was dug from the earth and heated and beaten and shaped into forms that have outlived the hands that made them. You think about the hands that will hold these weapons if the siege ever ends in the way that sieges sometimes end, with a rush and a clamour and a purpose that has been absent for so long that you can no longer imagine it clearly. And you think about the more likely outcome, the one that everyone understands but no one speaks of, the slow negotiation and the exchange of promises and the opening of the gate onto a world that has changed in ways that no one within these walls can predict. The armourer finishes his work and sets the last blade aside, and the grindstone slows and stops with a soft sigh of stone against its bearings. He wipes his hands on a cloth that has been used for this purpose so many times that it is stiff with accumulated oil and iron dust. And he looks around the armory with the expression of someone who is seeing it for the first time and finding it both familiar and strange. The weapons wait in their racks and barrels and chests, the shields lean against the wall. The grindstone sits silent and patient in the center of the room. Nothing has changed, and everything has changed, and you rise from your stool and duck through the low door and return to the grey light of the bailey, carrying the sound of the grindstone in your memory and the smell of oil and iron on your clothes, and the knowledge that tomorrow or the next day, or the day after that, you will return to this room and watch the same slow work performed on the same patient blades. Chapter 8. The Diet of the Dwindling Sack. You notice the change in the bread before you notice it in anything else, because bread is the foundation upon which all other meals are built, and its presence or absence or alteration colours every hour of every day in ways that are subtle but impossible to ignore. The bread that emerges from the kitchen ovens now is not the bread that emerged in the first weeks after the gate closed, and that earlier bread was itself not the bread of the time before the siege, when flour arrived regularly from the mill and the village and the farms beyond. The progression has been so gradual that you cannot point to a single day and say that the change occurred then, only that you look at the dense grey slice in your hand this morning and understand without needing to compare it to anything that it is different from the slice you held a month ago and different again from the slice you held the month before that. The flour that remains in the undercroft is still substantial in quantity. The steward's marks on his parchment confirm that many sacks remain, but its composition has shifted as the steward has drawn from different parts of the store according to a logic that only he fully understands. The finest flour, the pale powder that made bread light and almost white in the centre, was consumed first because it does not keep as well as the coarser grindings, and because there was no reason in the early days of the siege to deny the household the small comfort of familiar food. The medium flour came next, slightly darker and slightly heavier, and carrying more of the bran and the germ that give bread its substance and its flavour. And now the sacks that are opened contain the coarsest grindings, the flour that was milled last from the outer portions of the grain, and mixed with this flour are increasing amounts of other substances that would not normally be called flour at all, but have become flour by necessity and the slow pressure of dwindling auctions. The peas that were once reserved for the evening pottage have been dried further and ground between stones until they yielded a pale greenish powder that the baker adds to the dough in careful proportions. The proportion has increased over time, not because anyone decided it should, but because the wheat flour has decreased and the peas remain, and the baker must produce a certain number of loaves each day, regardless of what the loaves contain. The dough that results from this combination is heavier than pure wheat dough and stickier in a way that makes it difficult to work, and it requires more kneading and more resting and more patience than the baker is accustomed to giving. You have watched him work this dough on the long wooden table in the kitchen, his forearms dusted with the greyish powder and his brow furrowed with the concentration of someone who is solving a problem that has no perfect solution. He folds and presses and turns and folds again, and the dough slowly transforms from a shaggy mass into something that will hold together long enough to be baked, though it will never achieve the smooth, elastic surface that proper wheat dough achieves. The beans came next in the progression, not fresh beans which were consumed long ago, but the dried beans that had been stored in clay jars in the coolest corner of the undercroft. These beans were soaked and boiled and mashed into a paste that was then dried again on flat stones near the hearth until it could be ground into a coarse brown flour that smells faintly of earth and the pods from which it came. The baker adds this bean flour to the dough in smaller amounts than the pea flour because its flavour is stronger and less pleasant, a sort of flat bitterness that lingers on the tongue and reminds you of the way the undercroft smells in its deepest corners. The combination of wheat and peas and beans produces a dough that is grey in colour, not the warm grey of stone or the soft grey of the sky, but a dull and uniform grey that speaks of the absence of anything that might have made it otherwise. The loaves that emerge from the oven are smaller than they once were, and denser in a way that makes them feel heavier in your hand even though the actual weight is less. The crust is thick and hard and requires real effort to break, and the interior is close textured and slightly gummy, and fills your mouth with a substance that must be chewed for a long time before it can be swallowed. You have learned to eat this bread slowly, not because you are savoring it, but because eating it quickly is difficult and unpleasant, and serves no purpose when there is nothing else to do with the time that eating fills. You break off small pieces and hold them in your mouth until your saliva softens them enough to chew, and you chew until the mass is reduced to a paste that can be swallowed without effort, and then you break off another small piece and begin again. The absence of salt has become more noticeable as the other flavors have faded. Salt was never abundant in Harwood Castle. It arrived in irregular shipments from the coast and was stored in a stone crock that was kept near the kitchen hearth. But there was always enough to season the food in a way that made eating something more than mere sustenance. The crock is nearly empty now, and the steward has reserved what remains for the preservation of any fresh meat that might become available, though no fresh meat has become available since the gate closed, and none is expected until it opens again. The bread is made without salt. The pottage is made without salt. The salted fish and pork are soaked in water to remove as much of their preserving salt as possible, so that the salt can be saved and used again, and the result is a diet that tastes of the ingredients themselves without the enhancement that salt provides. The peas taste more like peas than they ever did when they were seasoned. The beans taste more like beans, the grain tastes more like grain, and you've discovered that these pure flavors are not necessarily pleasant, but are at least honest and straightforward, and require no interpretation. The kitchen servants scrape the bowls more thoroughly now than they did in the early weeks, not because anyone has instructed them to, but because the food has become too valuable to waste even the thinnest film that clings to the inside of a vessel. You've watched them work their wooden spoons around the curves of the bowls, gathering the last traces of pottage and conveying them to waiting mouths with a care that would have seemed excessive in the time before the siege. The bowls themselves are simple things made of turned wood that has been darkened by years of use and the absorption of countless meals, and they have a smoothness that comes from being scraped clean so many times that no roughness remains. When the meal is finished and the bowls are stacked beside the hearth to await the next use, they are so clean that they might almost be mistaken for bowls that have been washed. Though washing requires water, and water requires fuel, and fuel requires fuel, and fuel requires wood that must be carried and split and burned. And so the scraping serves instead. The periods between meals have grown longer and quieter as the food itself has grown sparser and plainer. The morning meal comes when the grey light has established itself sufficiently to see by, and it consists of a portion of the grey bread and sometimes a cup of weak ale that has been brewed from the last of the malt and tastes more of water than of grain. The evening meal comes when the light has faded, to the point where the hearth fire provides the only illumination, and it consists of a bowl of pottage made from whatever the steward has released from the undercroft, peas and beans, and the occasional fragment of salted fish or pork that has been soaked and boiled until it is soft enough to chew. Between these two meals there is nothing but the long, slow passage of the hours and the gradual awareness of a hollow sensation in your stomach that is not quite hunger and not quite satisfaction, but something between the two that you have learned to inhabit without complaint. The dried pork skin has become a sort of currency in the quiet economy of the household, not because it is valuable, but because it lasts and provides something to do with your teeth and your tongue during the long still intervals when there is nothing else to occupy them. The skin comes from the salted pork barrels, where it has been packed against the meat as a barrier and a preservative, and it has absorbed the salt and the smoke and the slow passage of months until it has become a substance that is almost not food at all, but rather a material that can be chewed indefinitely, without diminishing. You have a piece of this skin in your pouch, a small rectangle about the size of your palm and the thickness of a finger, and you take it out sometimes and work at it with your back teeth, feeling the resistance and the slow release of a faint pork flavor that is more memory than reality. The chewing occupies your mouth and gives your jaw something to do and provides a rhythm that helps the hours pass. And when you are finished, you return the piece to your pouch, where it will wait until the next time you need the comfort of a task that requires nothing but patience. The ale that was brewed in the autumn has dwindled to a few barrels that are reserved for special occasions that never seem to arrive, and the daily drink is now water from the well that has been boiled and cooled and stored in clay pitchers near the kitchen door. The water tastes of the stone from which it came and of the smoke from the fire that boiled it, and it fills your stomach with a coolness that is refreshing for a moment, and then fades into the general background of sensation. You drink it slowly throughout the day, taking small sips from a wooden cup that you carry with you from place to place, and you've learned to distinguish the different flavors that the water acquires depending on how long it has sat in the pitcher, and whether the pitcher was clean when it was filled, and whether the fire was burning oak or ash when the water was boiled. These distinctions are small and probably imaginary, but they give texture to an experience that would otherwise be as flat and uniform as the grey bread itself. The kitchen garden that once supplied fresh herbs and greens to supplement the stored provisions has been picked clean, and then picked again for anything that might be edible, and the bare earth where the plants grew is now covered with a thin layer of frost each morning that melts as the day progresses and leaves the soil dark and wet and waiting. You have walked through this garden many times, noting the empty spaces where the cabbages and the leeks and the parsley once grew, and you've wondered, without urgency, whether the roots that remain in the ground might send up new growth when the season turns. The season has not turned and shows no sign of turning, and the garden remains a memory of abundance rather than a source of it. The cook has become inventive in ways that would have seemed unnecessary in the time before the siege, combining ingredients that were never meant to be combined and producing dishes that are strange but edible, and sometimes even interesting in their strangeness. The pea flour has been mixed with water and fried on a hot stone to produce a flat cake that is crisp on the outside and chewy within, and this cake has become a small luxury that is distributed sparingly and received with gratitude. The bean paste has been thinned with water and seasoned with dried herbs that were gathered in the summer and hung from the rafters to dry, and the resulting broth is thin and brown and tastes of the earth from which the beans came. The salted fish has been pounded into a paste with breadcrumbs and formed into small balls that are dropped into the pottage and cooked until they are firm enough to hold their shape. These innovations are small and incremental, and they do not change the fundamental fact that the food is diminishing in both quantity and quality, but they provide a small variation in the routine and something to talk about during the long evenings around the hearth. The texture of the food has become as important as its taste, perhaps more important because the taste has faded to a narrow range of earthy and bland and faintly bitter notes that no longer surprise you. The bread is dense and requires real work from your teeth. The pottage is thin and slides down your throat with barely any resistance. The dried pork skin is tough and elastic and seems to expand the more you chew it. Your mouth has learned these textures and anticipates them and receives them without disappointment, because disappointment requires an expectation that something else might be possible, and you have let go of those expectations along with so many others. The children of the household have adapted to the changing diet in ways that both surprise you and seem entirely natural. They do not remember the bread of the time before the siege, or if they remember they do not speak of it, and they eat the grey, dense loaves with the same matter-of-fact acceptance that they bring to everything else. They have developed games around the dried pork skin, seeing who can chew a piece the longest without swallowing, or who can soften it enough to tear off a small fragment. Their laughter still rises in the darkened hall, and you listen to it and feel something that is not quite hope and not quite resignation, but a sort of quiet acknowledgement that life continues in the forms that are available to it. The steward's marks on his parchment have grown more numerous and more careful as the supplies have dwindled, and you have noticed that he now counts the sacks and barrels not once but twice during each circuit of the undercroft, as though verifying a number that he already knows but cannot quite believe. The rate of consumption has been steady, a certain number of measures of flour each day, and a certain number of portions of fish or pork each week, and the arithmetic of the situation is clear to anyone who cares to perform it. The supplies will last for some months yet at the current rate, and the current rate can be reduced further if necessary, and beyond that there is nothing to be done except to continue and to wait. You have noticed that your body has changed in small ways during the months of the siege, ways that are visible only to you because you are the one who inhabits it. Your belt can be drawn one hole tighter than it could in the autumn, and your wrists seem narrower when you look at them in the grey light that falls through the high window. These changes are not alarming because they have occurred so slowly that each day's difference is imperceptible, and you have accepted them as you have accepted the changing bread and the fading light and the patient presence of the besiegers in their camp beyond the walls. Your body is simply adjusting to the conditions that prevail, finding a new equilibrium that requires less fuel to maintain, and this adjustment is as natural and as inevitable as the rust on the armorer's blades or the retreat of the cistern water. The evening meal on this particular day is the same as the evening meal on the day before and the day before that. A bowl of thin pottage made from peas and beans and a single fragment of salted fish that has been boiled so long it has dissolved into threads that are barely visible in the grey liquid. You eat it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through your chest and stomach, and you scrape the bowl with your wooden spoon until the surface is clean and dry. The bread that accompanies the pottage is the grey dense bread that you've come to know so well, and you break off small pieces and chew them carefully and swallow them with sips of the boiled well water. The meal is not satisfying in the way that meals once were, but it is sufficient, and sufficiency has become its own kind of satisfaction. You sit in the great hall after the meal and watch the hearth fire burn down to embers and listen to the quiet sounds of the household settling into the long, dark hours. Your stomach feels neither full nor empty, but simply present. A small warm weight in your center that reminds you that you have eaten and will eat again, and that the interval between those events is just another measure of the slow time that governs everything within these walls. The dried pork skin is in your pouch, and you will chew it later when the darkness is complete, and there is nothing else to do with your mouth and your mind. And tomorrow the baker will mix his grey dough, and the steward will count his sacks, and the bowls will be scraped clean again, and the slow arithmetic of the siege will continue in its patient and unremarkable way. Chapter 9. The Sound of Patience. The sound that wakes you on this particular morning is not a sound you have heard before, or perhaps it is a sound you have heard so rarely that your sleeping mind cannot place it and must rouse your waking mind to perform the identification. You lie still in your alcove with the straw rustling beneath you and the grey light just beginning to establish itself in the high window, and you listen to the sound repeat itself, a low, flat note that carries across the damp air and through the stone walls and into the quiet center of your awareness. It is a horn, you realize after a moment, not a musical instrument played for pleasure, but a signal horn of the sort that heralds use to announce their presence before delivering a message. The sound is not urgent or alarming. It is simply a sound that has not been part of the daily texture of the siege, and therefore stands out from the dripping of the well and the stamping of the horses and the soft murmur of the household. You rise from your pallet and move toward the source of the sound without haste, because haste has become a foreign concept during the months of waiting, and your body no longer knows how to produce it. The bailey is damp with the mist that has settled overnight, a fine grey moisture that clings to the cobblestones and the walls and the wooden cover of the well, and makes everything look softer and less distinct than it does in the drier light of midday. Other people are emerging from the great hall and the stables and the various corners of the castle where they have spent the night, and they are moving toward the gate with the same unhurried pace that you are moving, drawn by the sound of the horn but not compelled by it. The horn sounds again as you walk, closer now and clearer, and you can hear the slight waver in the note that speaks of a human breath behind the brass, a person who is also standing in the damp morning and waiting for a response. The gate remains closed, of course. The heavy oak timbers and the iron bands and the great bar that was dropped into its brackets on that autumn afternoon that now seems to belong to another lifetime entirely. The watchman from the war-walk is descending the narrow stair from the gatehouse turret, his cloak dark with the moisture it has absorbed during the night, and he carries with him the knowledge of what he has seen from his high vantage. His face is calm and unsurprised, the face of someone who has been watching the same landscape for months and has finally observed a variation in its pattern, and he walks toward the entrance to the great hall where the lord of the castle will be informed of the development in the proper and unhurried manner. You do not follow him into the great hall because there is no reason to follow him, and you take your place instead near the well, where you can observe the gate and the wall-walk and the small gathering of household members who have assembled to wait for whatever comes next. The mist is beginning to thin as the grey light strengthens, revealing the shapes of the battlements above, and the faint suggestion of movement on the wall walk where another watchman has taken the place of the one who descended. The horn does not sound again, its message having been delivered and acknowledged by the simple fact of the castle's continued presence, and the silence that follows is the ordinary silence of a damp morning in a place that has learned to wait. The Lord emerges from the great hall after a time that feels neither long nor short, because time has lost its usual measures within these walls. He is dressed in the same woolen linen that everyone wears, his cloak darkened by the dampness and his boots worn at the heels from the countless circuits of the bailey and the hall and the wall walk that have filled his days since the gate closed. He does not look like a man who is about to engage in a dramatic confrontation. He looks like a man who has been woken earlier than he intended, and is moving through the necessary motions with the same patient acceptance that characterizes everything within the castle. He walks toward the gatehouse turret and climbs the narrow stair, and you watch him disappear into the stone and then reappear on the wall walk above, a dark figure against the grey sky, looking out at the field where the herald stands, with his horn and his message. The parley that follows is not the parley of the ballads. There are no banners snapping in the wind, and no armoured champions riding forth to exchange challenges, and no crowd of onlookers cheering from the battlements. There is only the slow and careful negotiation of terms between two parties who have grown equally tired of the waiting, and who understand that the outcome will be determined not by feats of arms, but by the patient arithmetic of supplies and seasons, and the simple desire to be done with a situation that has long since ceased to serve any purpose. The Lord descends from the wall walk and gives quiet instructions to the steward, and the steward disappears into the undercroft and emerges with a rolled parchment that has been waiting for this moment, a document prepared weeks or months ago against the possibility that a parley might eventually occur. The gate is not opened, not yet, because opening the gate would be a concession that has not been earned and a risk that has not been justified. Instead, a small postern door is unbarred, a narrow opening in the base of the gatehouse that leads to a passage through the thickness of the wall and emerges on the outer face of the curtain. This door has not been used since the gate closed, and its hinges protest with a sound that is high and thin and somehow plaintive, the sound of metal that has forgotten the purpose for which it was forged. The steward ducks through the low opening and walks out onto the track that leads down toward the village and the besiegers' camp, and he carries the rolled parchment in one hand and a small leather case containing the Lord's seal in the other, and he walks with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who understands that nothing about this process will be improved by hurrying. You watch from the bailey because there is nothing to see from the bailey except the open postern door and the slice of grey landscape that is visible through it, but you can imagine the scene that is unfolding on the track below because you have imagined it many times during the long still hours on the wall walk. The steward will meet the besiegers' representative at a point midway between the castle gate and the camp, a spot that has been chosen because it is visible from both positions and offers no advantage to either side. They would exchange the formal greetings that custom requires, and then the steward will present the parchment and the representative will read it, or will pretend to read it, or will carry it back to the camp where someone else will read it and compose a response. The parchment contains words that have been chosen with great care, phrases that establish the Lord's rights and acknowledge the reality of the situation, without admitting anything that could be used against him in future disputes. It is a document of legal precision rather than poetic force, and its effect will depend not on the eloquence of its language, but on the exhaustion of everyone involved. The hours that follow the steward's departure are filled with the same small routines that have filled all the hours since the gate closed. The kitchen servants make their trips to the well, the baker mixes his grey dough, the armourer sits at his bench and rubs oil into blades that will not be used. The only difference is the postern door standing open in the gatehouse wall, a dark rectangle that admits a thin stream of outside air and the smell of wet earth and dormant grass and the faint smoke of the besiegers' fires. You find yourself walking past this door several times during the morning, not because you intend to look through it, but because its presence changes the shape of the bailey, and your feet follow the new paths that this change creates. The air that enters through the door is colder than the air inside the walls, and carries a freshness that you had forgotten, the smell of a world that has continued to exist and change while the castle remains sealed and still. The steward returns in the early afternoon, emerging from the mist that has thickened again, and stepping through the postern door with the same unhurried pace with which he departed. He carries a different parchment now, a response from the besiegers' captain that is sealed with wax of a different color and impressed with a device that you cannot see from your position near the well. He does not speak to anyone as he crosses the bailey, and his face reveals nothing of what the parchment contains, but there is a quality to his movement that suggests the long wait is approaching its conclusion, a slight relaxation in his shoulders that was not present when he left. He disappears into the great hall, and the postern door is closed behind him, its hinges protesting once more and then falling silent. The reading of the response takes place in the great hall, with only the lord and the steward and a few others present, and you are not among them, because there is no reason for you to be among them. You learn the contents of the response through the slow diffusion of information that serves as news within the walls. A word passed from one person to another during the ordinary course of the day. A phrase overheard and repeated and gradually assembled into a coherent understanding. The besiegers have agreed to terms, or rather, they have proposed terms of their own that are close enough to the Lord's terms that the difference can be resolved through the exchange of further documents, rather than through any more dramatic means. The settlement involves a sum of money to be paid over a period of years, a sum that is large enough to be meaningful, but not so large as to be impossible, and it involves a rearrangement of certain rights and obligations that will change who holds the tax ledger for a particular district, but will not change the daily lives of anyone who lives there. It is an agreement of the sort that scribes and lawyers and stewards spend their careers producing, a document that will be filed away and forgotten until some future dispute requires it to be consulted again. The garrison receives this news with the quiet that has characterized everything since the gate closed, a quiet that is not disappointment exactly, but rather the acknowledgement of an outcome that was always the most likely and has now been confirmed. There will be no assault to repel, and no dramatic relief column arriving on the horizon, and no moment of triumph or tragedy that would make a good story for the evenings around the hearth. There will be only the slow process of verifying the terms and drafting the final agreement and making the arrangements for the opening of the gate and the resumption of ordinary life. The besiegers will withdraw to wherever they came from. The village will be reoccupied by its inhabitants who have been sheltering behind the walls or hiding in the forest. The carts will begin to move again along the track and up to the castle gate, and the long grey months of the siege will recede into memory and eventually into the kind of story that is told on winter evenings and then forgotten when the fire burns low. The final days before the gate opens are filled with the same small routines as the days that came before, because there is nothing else to do, and because the habits of waiting have become so deeply ingrained that they cannot be abandoned simply because the waiting is nearly over. The steward continues to count his sacks and barrels, though now his marks are made with a lighter hand and his expression carries less of the tightness around the eyes. The baker continues to mix his grey dough, though there is a promise in the air that fresh flour will arrive before the current supply is exhausted. The armourer continues to oil his blades, though the rust will have less time to bloom once the gate is open and the damp air of the castle is diluted by the drier air of the outside world. The well continues to drip, and the cistern continues to retreat, and the dust motes continue to drift in the shafts of light, and you continue to observe these things with the same patient attention you have given them all along. The morning of the gate's opening arrives without ceremony, a day like the days that preceded it, with the same grey sky and the same damp air, and the same soft sounds of the household stirring to wakefulness. You are standing in the bailey when the bar is lifted from its brackets, not by the same two men who placed it there in the autumn, but by different men whose faces are familiar and whose movements are the same, slow, deliberate movements that the task requires. The bar rises and the iron protests in its familiar voice, and the oak slides against the brackets, and then the bar is free and is carried to the place where it will wait until it is needed again. The great leaves of the gate swing inward with a sound that you had forgotten, a deep and resonant grinding of iron hinges that have not moved in months and must be persuaded to remember their purpose. The sound carries through the bailey and into the great hall and up the turnpike stair, and it is the sound of one thing ending and another thing beginning, though the distinction between the two is less clear than you might have imagined. The world outside the gate is the same world you remember from the autumn, the same track leading down to the same village, and the same fields and the same distant line of trees. But it is also different in ways that are subtle and cumulative and difficult to name. The grass is longer and paler, The trees are bare where they were not bare before. The air smells of wet earth and wood smoke, and the faint, clean scent of a world that has continued to turn while the castle stood still. You step through the gate and feel the ground beneath your feet, the packed earth of the track that has been churned by the boots of the besiegers and the hooves of their horses and the wheels of their carts. The evidence of their presence is everywhere in the form of ruts and footprints and the black circles where their fires burned. But the people themselves are gone, withdrawn to wherever they came from, leaving behind only the traces that will be erased by the next rain and the next season, and the slow, patient work of the grass reclaiming the earth. You walk a short distance down the track, and then stop and turn to look back at the castle. The walls rise grey and solid and familiar, and the gate stands open in their face, a dark rectangle that leads back to the world you have inhabited for so many months. The siege is over and nothing has changed and everything has changed, and you stand in the damp morning air and feel the weight of the closed gate lift from your shoulders and the new weight of the open gate settle in its place. The world resumes its ordinary rhythms around you. The slow turning of the seasons, and the patient passage of the clouds, and the distant sound of a cart beginning its journey up the track from the village. And you turn and walk back through the gate and into the bailey, where the well continues to drip and the steward continues to count. And the long, quiet afternoon of the castle's life stretches out before you without end. Chapter 10. The turning of the lock. The gate stands open now, and you cannot stop looking at it. The space where the heavy oak leaves used to meet in the solid wall of timber and iron is now a gap that admits the grey light of the outside world and the smell of wet earth and the faint distant sounds of a landscape that has continued to exist while the castle held its breath. You have passed through this opening several times since the bar was lifted and the hinges were persuaded to remember their function, and each passage has felt like a small betrayal of the patient stillness that sustained you through the months of waiting. The world outside is not dramatically different from the world you left when the gate closed. The same grey sky and the same bare trees and the same track winding down toward the village. But it feels different in ways that your body registers even if your mind cannot articulate them. The air moves more freely outside, carrying scents that have not been filtered through stone and straw, and the slow respiration of confined animals. The light falls on your face from a wider angle, unobstructed by walls and battlements and the narrow slits that served as windows. Your feet sink slightly into the mud of the track, mud that has not been packed down by the daily passage of boots and hooves and cart wheels, and you feel the give of the earth in a way that you had forgotten was possible. The besiegers' camp has been dismantled and removed with the same unhurried efficiency that characterized everything about their presence. Where their tents and lean-tos stood, there are now only circles of flattened grass and the blackened patches where their cooking fires burned, and these traces are already beginning to fade as the damp air and the slow work of the earth reclaim the ground. A few broken objects remain scattered across the field, things that were not worth the effort of carrying away. A cracked clay pot and a length of frayed rope and a cartwheel that has lost several spokes and leans against a stone as though resting from a long journey. You have walked among these remnants and felt nothing in particular about them. Neither triumph nor resentment, nor any of the emotions that the ballads would assign to such a moment. They are simply the evidence that other people were here and have now gone, and their departure has changed the view from the wall walk, but not the fundamental fact of the wall walk itself, or the patient duty of watching that will continue as long as the castle stands. The village below the castle is beginning to stir with the return of its inhabitants, though the process is so slow and so quiet that you might not notice it if you were not deliberately attending. A thin column of smoke rises from one of the chimneys now, and then another, and the smoke leans with the wind and dissipates into the general greyness of the sky, just as the besiegers' smoke did, but with a different quality that you cannot quite name. Figures move among the houses and along the single lane that runs between them, small dark shapes against the pale brown of the winter grass, and they carry bundles and tools and the small possessions that they took with them when they fled behind the walls or into the forest. You recognize some of these figures by their gait and their posture, though their faces are too distant to distinguish, and you feel a quiet kinship with them that requires no words or acknowledgement. They are returning to the rhythms that were interrupted by the closing of the gate, and you are returning to the rhythms that were established by its closing and must now be adjusted to its opening. The first cart arrives in the afternoon, drawn by a single ox whose breath rises in white plumes that merge with the mist hanging over the track. The cart is loaded with goods from the village and from the farms beyond, fresh supplies to replenish the stores that have been so carefully measured and conserved through the months of the siege. There are sacks of flour that will make bread lighter and paler than the grey dense loaves you have grown accustomed to, and there are bundles of fresh straw that will replace the musty layers on the floors of the great hall and the sleeping alcoves, and there are jars of honey and pots of preserved fruit, and a small barrel of salt that will restore the flavour to meals that have grown bland through the long winter. You watch the cart creak up the track and pass through the open gate and into the bailey, and you watch the steward emerge from the undercroft with his parchment and his charcoal to record the arrival of these new provisions. His face carries the same calm expression it has always carried, but there is a lightness in his step that was not there before, a small relaxation of the vigilance that has defined his days since the gate closed. The straw is the first thing to be changed, because the musty layers on the floors have become a presence that everyone has learned to ignore, but no one has ceased to notice. The old straw is raked into piles and carried out through the gate in rough bundles bound with twine, and it is stacked in a corner of the outer bailey where it will eventually be burned or spread on the garden as mulch, or simply left to complete its slow transformation into earth. The new straw is golden and fragrant, and it crackles underfoot with a sound that you had forgotten, a dry and lively sound that speaks of summer fields and the cutting of grass under a sun that seems now like something from a story. The great hall smells different with the new straw, fresher and lighter, and somehow more spacious, though the dimensions of the room have not changed and the high timber roof remains lost in the same shadows that have always concealed it. The smell of the stables still rises through the turnpike stair, and the smell of the stone still underlies everything, but the new straw has added a note of renewal that changes the balance of the castle's fragrance in ways that are subtle but unmistakable. The well continues to drip, and the cistern continues to hold its dark still water, and the wind continues to hum through the gaps in the crenellations, because these things are not changed by the opening of a gate. The rhythms that sustained the castle through the siege will continue to sustain it through the peace that follows. The daily trips to the well, and the slow inventory of the stores, and the patient watching from the wall walk. The difference is not in the tasks themselves, but in the context that surrounds them. The knowledge that the gate can be opened when it needs to be opened, and that the world outside is accessible again, and that the long grey months of confinement have become a memory rather than a present reality. You find yourself performing the same actions you performed yesterday, and the day before, and all the days before that, but you perform them with a different quality of attention, a slight relaxation of the focus that was required when every resource was finite and every action had consequences that could not be escaped. The rain begins in the late afternoon, not the fine mist that has characterized so many of the days since the gate closed, but a true rain that falls in steady vertical lines from a sky that has darkened to a deeper shade of grey. The sound of it on the roof of the great hall is louder than the sound of the mist, a soft percussion that fills the air and masks the smaller sounds of the household and creates a kind of privacy for anyone who sits and listens. You find a place near the hearth where the fire has been built up with wood from the replenished pile, and you watch the flames through the open door of the great hall while the rain falls on the cobblestones of the bailey and gathers in shallow puddles that reflect the grey light of the sky. The rain is washing the courtyard, carrying away the dust and the debris and the accumulated traces of the months of waiting, and the stones emerge darker and cleaner, and somehow renewed by the simple passage of water. The ox cart that brought the supplies has been unloaded, and is now being loaded again with the things that must be taken away. The old straw and the broken tools and the barrels that have been emptied of their contents and are no longer needed. The ox stands patiently in the rain, with its head lowered and its eyes half closed, and its hide is dark with moisture and steaming slightly from the warmth of its body. The driver moves slowly around the cart, adjusting the load and checking the harness and performing the small tasks that must be performed before the journey back down the track can begin. He does not hurry, and he does not complain about the rain. He simply does what needs to be done with the same patient acceptance that has characterized everything within these walls since the gate closed, and that will continue to characterize everything now that it is opened again. You think about the months that have passed, not in any organized or sequential way, but in fragments and impressions that surface and fade without your conscious direction. The sound of the bar dropping into its brackets on that autumn afternoon, the smell of the undercroft and the sight of the steward counting his sacks, the drip of the well and the slow retreat of the cistern, the grey bread and the dried pork skin, and the long, still hours on the wall walk watching the smoke rise from the besiegers' fires. These memories are not arranged in any order that would make a proper story. They are simply the texture of a time that has ended and is now receding into the past, where it will be softened and simplified and eventually forgotten, except for the few details that happen to stick in the mind for reasons that no one can explain. You do not feel any particular emotion about this ending, neither relief nor nostalgia nor the satisfaction of survival. You feel simply that something has happened and is now over, and that the world continues in its ordinary fashion. The rain intensifies for a while and then diminishes, and the light begins to fade toward the deeper grey of evening. The ox cart creaks through the gate and down the track, its load of old straw and empty barrels swaying with the movement of the wheels over the uneven ground. The driver does not look back, and the ox does not look back, and you watch them until they disappear round the first bend and are lost to sight. The gate remains open behind them, a dark rectangle in the grey stone, and the rain continues to fall on the empty courtyard and the cobblestones and the wooden cover of the well. The puddles are growing larger now, merging with one another to form a shallow sheet of water that covers most of the bailey and reflects the darkening sky in a surface that is broken only by the impact of fresh raindrops. You remain in the doorway of the great hall for a long time, watching the rain and listening to its sound on the roof and the stones and the water that has gathered on the ground. The household moves around you in its ordinary rhythms, preparing the evening meal and tending the fire and settling into the long dark hours that lie ahead. The smells of cooking drift from the kitchen and mingle with the smell of the rain and the clean scent of the new straw and the ever-present mineral breath of the stone. The new flour has made bread that is lighter in colour and softer in texture than the grey loaves of the siege, and the taste of it is strange and familiar at the same time, a memory of abundance that your mouth has not forgotten. Even if your conscious mind has allowed the memory to fade, you eat your portion slowly and deliberately, feeling the texture of the bread against your tongue and the warmth of it in your stomach, and you think, without urgency, about all the meals that have been eaten in this hall, and all the meals that will be eaten here after you are gone. The evening passes in the same quiet fashion that all evenings have passed since the gate closed, with the hearth fire burning down to embers, and the voices of the household murmuring in the darkness, and the soft sounds of bodies settling into their sleeping places. The only difference is the open gate, and the rain falling beyond it, and the knowledge that tomorrow the world will continue in its ordinary fashion, and the day after that, and the day after that, and that the siege will become a story told to children on winter nights, and then forgotten when the fire burns low. You lie in your alcove with the new straw rustling beneath you, and the smell of the rain drifting through the open gate, and the distant sound of water dripping from the eaves, and you let your thoughts dissolve into the general quiet that has become your natural state. The rain continues through the night and into the morning, softening from the steady fall of the afternoon to the fine mist that is more familiar, and then returning to its steady rhythm again. When you rise and walk to the doorway of the great hall, the bailey is a sheet of shallow water that reflects the grey sky and the grey walls and the dark rectangle of the open gate. The cobblestones are clean and dark and gleaming, washed of the dust and the debris and the accumulated traces of the months of waiting. The well cover is dark with moisture, and the rope that hangs from the windlass is heavy with the water it has absorbed, and the dripping from the depths continues with the same patient rhythm that has sustained it through the siege and will sustain it through whatever comes next. The cistern beneath the keep is filling slowly with the rainwater that has been channeled from the roofs, and the marks on the wall will show a higher level when next you descend to check them. You step out into the rain and feel it on your face and your hands and the wool of your cloak, which grows heavier as it absorbs the moisture. The rain is cold, but not unpleasantly so, and you stand in the centre of the bailey and look up at the grey sky and the grey walls and the high narrow windows that have admitted the only light you have known for so many months. The castle surrounds you as it has always surrounded you, solid and patient and indifferent to your presence, and you feel the weight of its stone and the depth of its history, and the slow continuity that connects this moment to all the moments that have come before, and all the moments that will follow. The siege is over, and the gate is open, and the world has resumed its ordinary rhythms, and you are part of those rhythms in the same way that the well is part of them, and the cistern is part of them, and the stone is part of them, and the stone is part of them. The rain will stop eventually, and the sun will emerge from behind the grey clouds, and the puddles in the bailey will shrink and disappear, and the cobblestones will dry to their ordinary colour. The carts will continue to arrive from the village and the fields and the world beyond, bringing the supplies that will replenish the stores and the news that will connect the castle to the larger currents of the world. The steward will continue to count his sacks and barrels, and the baker will continue to mix his dough, and the armourer will continue to oil his blades against the rust that is always seeking a foothold. The watchman will continue to walk the wall walk and count his paces and observe the changing colour of the grass and the distant smoke from the village chimneys. And you will continue to be present in all of these moments, observing and participating and letting the slow time of the castle carry you forward into whatever comes next. You turn and walk back through the rain to the doorway of the great hall, and you pause on the threshold to look back once more at the open gate and the grey sky and the clean, wet stones of the bailey. The rain has washed the memory of confinement away into the muddy ground, and what remains is simply the castle as it has always been and will always be, a place of stone and timber and patient waiting that endures beyond any single siege or any single lifetime. You step inside and let the warmth of the hearth settle around you, and you listen to the rain on the roof and the dripping of the well and the soft sounds of the household going about its ordinary business, and you feel the quiet rhythm of the world resuming its course and carrying you with it into the long grey afternoon that stretches out without end.